o'clock. We will call the October 25th, 2022 special meeting to order. Keith, if you could lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. If you could all please remain standing just for a second. I'd like to have a moment of silence for Lieutenant DeMonte and Sergeant Hamsey, who unfortunately lost their lives just a few short days ago, it seems. Thank you. Okay. We will now start our meeting with public comments. We will begin with those here in person. If you'd please come to the podium, state your name and address, and try and limit your comments to 5 minutes if you would.
Tim Kelly, 62 Westview. Mr. Chair, the basic job of any building committee is to deliver the finished project on time and under budget. Today, I understand the high school building committee is going to report that they are $10 million over budget. A huge miss. And this is just 1 year after kicking off the approved project. Now, I recall 18 months ago attending a number of town-run promotional information sessions. And as residents asked all the obvious questions, we were assured that quality contractors would be bidding aggressively, looking for work. Inflationary costs were all factored into the estimates, and any contingencies were, of course, covered. By the way, I don't know when it'll be made public, but there's no way this new facility will be fully completed by August 2024. We might want to just put that puck on the ice tonight as well. Look, there are lots of good intentions, and we've spared no expense on experts and consultants. But right now, all we have is a dirt lot and one less baseball field. And unfortunately, as this project progresses, I think we can expect in 18, 20 months, when the new building is 70% complete, to receive another $10 million emergency funding request. What I think we have here is an old-fashioned, out-of-control infrastructure project. And this is supposed to be a straightforward school building being constructed on an existing flat lot. At this point, it might be wise for the council to engage an independent body to do a full top-to-bottom program review of this project. What have we accomplished? Why are we where we are? Who's responsible? Etc. Then perhaps consider an expansive array of options going forward, which could range from using the $40 million already borrowed to simply address priority upgrades needed at the existing high school, to going back out to the taxpayers for a $20 million request, a revised timeline, in order to actually complete the new facility, and to avoid going back to taxpayers a third time. Again, as we sit here today, we haven't poured a yard of concrete. I'm confident that tonight we will hear a strong message that if we just quickly approve another $10 million, then all contractors will be locked and any contingencies covered. Just remember, these are the same people who assured us last year that all was good on $136 million. So I will be interested to see the intellectual curiosity of council members on display this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from those here in person? Seeing none. Kat, do we have anyone online with their hand raised?
We do. is Emily Collini.
Emily? Are you there?
Hi, how are you? I'm here, yes. It's always a process getting unmuted. I apologize. This is Emily Collini at 30 High Street. How are you all tonight? I am excited to hear what the building committee says after listening to their meeting last night. And I'm excited to hear what the town council thinks of this recommendation. I wanted to encourage the town council to strongly consider the advice getting and the recommendations you're getting from the building committee. I know that these are dedicated volunteers who have spent years working on this already. And through the value engineering process, they have already cut 9.4 million from the project. I'm aware that the messaging behind asking for more money is tricky. And I encourage the town council to be very clear that this money that we're asking for was given for this purpose, that the wording of the question in the last referendum prevents us from going over the budget without asking the voters again, and that it's not taxpayer money. I think it's really important that people understand that this is a good way for our town to get money back into giving the project that the voters already voted for once and approved, the type of project that they told us that they wanted, the type of project that the building committee can deliver if we can go ahead and get the full amount that they request tonight approved by the town council, and then the messaging on the way to the voters so that everyone is clear and we can keep this project moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other online?
I do not see any other hands raised.
Okay. We will then close public comment at this point. We will move to item D1, our presentation from the High School Building Committee.
All right, thank you very much, Council. My name is Megan Guerrera. I am the chair of the Farmington High School Building Committee. We appreciate the time with you this evening, and hopefully we're going to be able to provide you with some updates on a few things on the project. First and foremost, we are going to provide to you and share the bid results that we received ourselves as a building committee last week. As a result of what we did here last week, we're going to talk a little bit about potential next steps for the project, and then also put forth a recommendation based on some pretty thorough conversation by the building committee last week in regards to next steps overall. So that's what we'd like to address this evening. You're going to have a couple of people speaking with you tonight. I'm going to address some of the topics at hand. Kat will supplement, and then we'll also be hearing from a representative from O&G as well to talk a little bit more about the bids. So we certainly welcome conversation questions, but we're going to kind of walk you through the process and the discussion, and hopefully, you know, this really lays out the conversation for us and the discussion moving forward. So what we're actually going to start with, though, before we actually really get into an understanding of the bid results and the recommendation is kind of a level set of some work that's been done to date, obviously, for the building committee, and what that means and why it's important for us to all understand that before we continue with the conversation. So this is some important work that the building committee engaged in that was really work that was done pre-bid. So before we went out to bid, we did a lot of work. One of the things that you see up there is something called value engineering. It's really what we spent a majority of our time on as a building committee. We take our charge from the council very seriously as far as understanding what we need to deliver and being responsible around that as far as keeping the project within budget. So one of the first things we worked on and continue to work on was value engineering, which is really looking at different points within the project. And you see them listed here: schematic design, enhanced schematic design, design development and construction documents, and really taking a look at how do we sharpen our pencils and really make sure that we're spending that money wisely. And we went through, as I mentioned, there 3 or 4 different versions of value engineering. And what that brought us to is what you see there as a value management grand list. So what we were able to do is compile all the items that we actually value engineered or actually reduced the scope of the project in order to control cost. Okay, so we did and we have an entire list of those items that we have available. And what's important to understand here is we have a value management ground list, which was really looking at removing items from scope permanently. And then we had something called an add alternate list that we're going to talk about as well. Those items were additional scope of work that we didn't want to remove from the project completely. So we needed to understand what the overall cost was, and if we were able to afford them, be able to add them back into the project. So there's really two different pieces of work we did in order to help us keep a balanced budget throughout the project to date. So it's important to understand that through the VE process, to address the increase of cost estimates as we went through the process and re-looked at scope and understood the costs, we actually looked at that Emily actually mentioned, that $9,400,000 was cut from the project before the invitation to bid was even released. So this was our work that was done with the building project, with our professional partners, with many people at the table saying, what can we really do here to make sure that we're managing costs effectively on the project overall? So it's important to understand that's one piece of work that's already been done. That's work that has been, scope of work that's been removed from the project completely. It's not included in the budget. And the second piece we're going to talk about is the add alternates that we also discussed. So that's really the next page we're going to discuss. So again, here's a list of what we have determined are add alternates for the project, not in priority order in any way. But you can see there's 10 alternates listed here. And as I mentioned, these are items that we had hoped that if we had the ability to be able to add back into the project, we would do that based on the cost and the bid results we received. So this is all important work, things that we know we would really like to see added back into the project. And as well, you'll see there we did do a separate bid package specifically for the tennis court. So all things to consider as far as overall scope of work within the project. Two pieces of value engineering and add alternates that we did to really understand the budget and control the cost. All right. So keeping those things in mind, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the bidding process. So Laurel is here from O&G, our construction manager. She's going to walk through the bidding process, give you some high-level details, and then talk about some numbers for us.
Good evening, everyone. Again, Laurel Purcell with O&G Industries. We're your construction manager on the project. So just to kind of highlight what happened with the bidding, we went out to bid August 31st. We had a pre-bid meeting that was held on site to try to drive up interest in the project. We ended up with 3 separate bid opening dates. We knew that we needed to get critical contracts in earlier, letting the details, clarifications take place for the remaining bid packages. Since all of the bids have been received, we have started doing scope reviews. We've scoped all of the critical bid packages, as well as starting to scope the remaining trade packages. So the whole goal is to make sure that we've met with the second and or low bidders to make sure that they have the project completely covered. Next. So the first bid opening that's up on the screen, it was representing the first bids that we received, which was on October 6th. And again, just a reminder, we had went out to bid August 31st. So we were on the street for quite a while, was about 6 weeks. The next bid opening was the very large opening with the majority of the trade packages coming in. That occurred on October 12th, which was just a couple of weeks ago. And then the final round came in last week on October 19th, and we've met with the building committee to report our results to them as soon as we receive those last remaining bid results. All in all, we received almost 120 bids for all the different trade packages. And then the bid results summary. So we have a budgeted amount of construction cost. When O&G will be putting together, they call it a guaranteed maximum price. So we will have scoped everyone. We've included all the costs. That would be the GMP costs. So we had a budget of $115,600,000. Our base bid with the low bidders, the parent low bidders, is $121,531,997. So there is a overage of $5.931,967. So there is an overage. Some of the bid packages, we only did receive single bids. They were over our estimate. For this calculation, we've included those higher numbers, but the intent is to go out and rebid, and hopefully it'll come down a little bit. But that is representing all the bids that we've received to date, and we have received all the bids. With that, I guess I turn it back over to you. Okay.
So with that, before we actually step into taking a look at some of the options for next step based on that number that we did receive, that overage we received, I'm actually going to ask Kat to talk a little bit more about some important information from a financial perspective to take in consideration as we continue.
So just a few points to keep in the back of your mind as we're walking through the three options that the building committee evaluated is one, the total project authorization. So the town is only authorized to spend $135.6 million, which was approved at referendum in June 2021. And we also received a reimbursement rate increase from the state of Connecticut, increasing our reimbursement rate from 18.93 for new construction and 28.93 for renovation to 30% for all items in the project. Now, this increase equates to an additional $14.7 million of the project cost offset by the state of Connecticut. So just keep those two things in mind as Meg's going through the options.
Okay, so, obviously, as we were presented with the bid results and the overage, the building committee was left with a conversation of what next steps do we need to take. And we wanted to make sure we did that in a thoughtful way, as I think we have done to date throughout the project, of really looking at all the information we have at hand, what are all the options, evaluating all those options for pros, cons, risks, et cetera, so that we can make a smart and informed decision, so that hopefully we can bring a recommendation to you for discussion. So with those bid results, we really kind of looked at this in three potential options that were in front of us. So our first option, and we're going to talk about each one of these in detail, but as a summary, we do have an option of utilizing contingency and or FF&E to cover costs. So everything we've talked about today as far as an overage is really an overage on the construction costs for the project. So it is possible, as always, that you can do some reallocation of dollars and take a look at it. Is that a way that we can help offset this overage? So we're going to talk about that as a potential option. We're going to talk about option number 2, which is a reduction of scope. That certainly is a way that you can adjust any kind of project budget or cost, is look at reduction of scope. And then option 3 is the potential of going back out to referendum to ask for additional funds to cover the overages. So really, when we looked at that, or you look at any project overall and kind of the levers you have to pull in any project, and I will say to you, one thing that we did discuss in the building committee was the overall timeline of the project. That's a pretty standard conversation in general in any project of what happens with your timeline. There really isn't anything from a timeline perspective that's going to manage cost for us here. Extending the timeline in any way it would only actually increase cost overall for the project. So it was one thing that we basically said that's not an option for us. So really, these are the 3 options that we have in front of us: is scope, reallocation of dollars, and actually increasing dollars that we use for the project. So those are the 3 options that we're going to walk through. So let's start with option 1, and as I mentioned, this is utilize contingency and or FF&E to cover costs. So these are obviously 2 other allocations within our project budget that have dollars in each one of those buckets, and they have specific purposes, as they note here. So we do have contingency dollars that help us manage towards unknown costs in the future, and FF&E, which is really kind of our furniture, fixtures, and anything that's regarding technology, things like that, exist inside that budget. So it's outside the construction budget. So what we'd be looking is pulling dollars from someplace else in the project to offset the increased cost of construction. So one of the things that, when we looked at it, as I said, we want to look at these fairly, each one, and look at pros and cons and risks associated. And obviously, if we were looking at reallocating dollars within our budget, one of the pros of this option, if we were to reallocate, was we could cover that 5.93 million overage in base bid through those dollars. So there's enough money that exists in both of those buckets to cover this 5.93 million overage. It puts us at a significant risk that we're going to talk about here. So it's really not necessarily responsible for us as a building committee to compromise the contingency budget this early in the project. As you mentioned, what contingency is normally used for, in a project like this or in any project is to take a look at unknown, costs or any other risks later in the project and making sure that we can cover those and adjust accordingly. So allowing, moving dollars from the contingency budget over to cover this overage now is really not overly responsible for us to manage it in that way. The cost for FF&E would need to be covered in the town's capital budget in the coming years with no reimbursement. So think about this, as I mentioned, FF&E is the furnitures, fixtures, all the technology piece that exists inside the project budget overall. It doesn't reduce, us moving that money out doesn't reduce the need. We still have a need for additional furniture and additional technology. We still have to fund it somehow. So does it make sense for us to reallocate money out of that portion of our budget to cover this overage now, if eventually we're going to have to cover it someplace else, most likely in a future capital budget? And again, remember, if we do that, there's no reimbursement against those dollars because it's outside the project at that point. So you got to look at, moving, running around has risks and concerns and cons to it when we're taking a look at it. And if in the pro section, I did mention it was covering that 5.9 million overage, and that, if you remember, this is really the base bid we're talking about. So this does not include any of those alternates. It doesn't include that separate bid package for the tennis courts. If we did this and we moved money out of contingency and FF&E to cover, we would only be covering the base bid, and we would still be left with some additional scope of work that we would like to include in the project. And frankly, that the community had actually voted on back in June. So it certainly is an option, one we considered, but really from a responsibility perspective and really understanding managing our financial view overall of the project, it really had a very high risk for us if this was the option we were to go with.
And just to add to that, the combined budget for FF&E and contingency is roughly $10 million. It's about $4 million in FF&E and $6 million in contingency. So when you're looking at $6 million, that would really compromise both or either one of those budgets.
All right, well, we go right on to option 2. So this is certainly always an option in any project, is a reduction of project scope. We also did and think back to the fact how we started the presentation this evening, is this is obviously one of the first things we do to look at controlling costs, so that those value engineering exercises, pulling items in to add alternates, doing our best to be able to kind of really make sure we're managing the project scope, with always having at the top of our mind to not impact educational programming. Obviously, we know sometimes when we get in these conversations, we lose the reason why we're doing what we're doing, and this is really to make sure that we're providing a future facility that's going to meet the needs of our community for a lot of different reasons, educationally as well as it being a community asset. So, we have to make sure we keep that in mind too, and we want to make sure we deliver a project that's going to be meaningful to the community. So really, reduction in project scope for us at this point, we don't see any pro in reducing the project scope at this point. We have spent so much time value engineering. We've spent so much time trying to build that out alternate list in a meaningful way that allows us to represent a project that makes sense and stays within budget to the best of our ability, but also doesn't impact that educational programming. So once we start getting into further reduction of scope on this project, and you can see the con, we will impact educational programming at this point. We have done the work, we've sharpened our pencils, we've had the conversations. We're at a significant tipping point now within this project that further reduction will impact educational programming. And, this is a tough one for all of us, I think, to have a conversation around. So, as I mentioned, the cuts have been beyond the committee's comfort level, and additional cuts would be detrimental. Additional items cut from the budget will need to be included in capital budget in the coming years without reimbursement. So once again, reducing the scope doesn't necessarily eliminate the future need, and we still are going to need to be able to manage that, and will require further spending. And once again, it is that base bid only. that we're talking about here. So as we mentioned, there's no alternates, there's no tennis courts. Everything basically is base bid, or at this point, if we're reducing scope, it's actually less. We're actually pulling back even more on what we're delivering in the project. So it is an option. It's certainly something we discussed and kind of looked at those pros and cons. And, we're really looking at a high-level risk to the project overall and the impact of education and potential long-term costs of how we manage against that. So that brings us to option 3, which is referendum. We're going to talk a little bit about the pros, and I want to start with the cons for this. So going out to referendum, so this is what I want to be really clear on here is the action of going out to referendum, to ask for additional dollars to cover overage plus more. There is no con to our project in that respect. There is really no risk. The project benefits from the additional state funds, and it's actually a benefit to us. There is obviously a risk associated with the referendum failing. That risk exists. But what we do understand is if it were to fail, if this is the option we go with, and the referendum does fail, then we obviously are back to looking at options 1 and 2 again. And we've kind of presented to you already what our concerns are around option 1 and 2. So option 3 to us allows this project to utilize the additional state reimbursement, as Kat mentioned in her kind of level set prior to walking through these options. And this option allows us to accept those alternates back into the project. So if you remember when I walked through 1 and 2, I very specifically said what we're addressing here is that base bid. It is the project as it exists right now with the ad alternates not included, with concern around the tennis courts, with all this, it's a view of the project that does not include that additional scope of work within the ad alternates. So this option 3 allows us to be able to go ahead, address the overage, think about pulling those ad alternates back in to the project so that it's a closer view to the building that actually was voted on by the community. And, then we manage the risk of what happens at referendum. But going out to referendum, we do not see as a con for the project overall, for the building committee. So with that, I think based on the conversation and the logic behind the 3, I'm going to actually ask Kat to talk about if option 3 is chosen and we do decide to move forward with that, what that timeline might look like.
So as you see on this slide, we would be working towards a December 8th, 2022 referendum. And that is a pretty quick timeline, and there are a few considerations that kind of force that timeline to happen. First is bids are only held for 90 days. So that was a factor in kind of backing out the time that a referendum would need to be held. 90 days of the bid opening would bring us to early January, but there's also the holiday season in the middle of that time. And if you remember, our charter requires us to hold a town meeting 10 days before a referendum. So you have to consider that in backing out the referendum date. And we didn't think it would be wise to have the town meeting or the referendum in the middle of the holiday season on New Year's Day or something like that. So that kind of brought us to that December 8th proposed referendum date. So working towards that date from today we're presenting the recommendation to Town Council. November 9th, if Town Council decides to move forward with this timeline, we would convert our building committee scheduled meeting to a community meeting to communicate all the information necessary. Having as many public discussions as possible we felt would be very beneficial, especially given this tight timeline. November 15th would be when the Town Council would send the project to town meeting or referendum. November 28th would be the proposed town meeting, which is 10 days before the December 8th referendum. So additional communications would obviously go out to the residents if this is the timeline to move forward with. A newsletter after today, if it is decided the town council wants to move forward, is already being drafted and ready to go. The communications committee is meeting tomorrow, if that is the council's decision to move forward, so that we can try to hit mailboxes in the next week or so. A community meeting again would be on November 9th. And then after after the town council sends it to town meeting and referendum, that triggers a blackout period. But we are allowed to send an explanatory text newsletter that is approved by the attorney during that time. So that would be a plan as well.
Okay. So with that information in mind, we wanted to make sure you had kind of a good snapshot of what option 3 would look like if we were to execute on that. So a couple things that we want to make sure you also have is some cost and an understanding of the overall recommendation when we take a look at dollars and what we're going to be recommending this evening. So one of the things we've shared with you already was the bid results and the overage there. We did show you a list of ad alternates, but the slides here are actually showing you cost associated to recommended ad alternates to include. So this, again, is the recommendation from the committee. So you'll see the description, and these map back to those ad alternates that we saw previously. And this is the total cost. These are actual bid numbers and what these items would actually cost us. So total alternates included, you can see there is 2.5. The total tennis court amount, as we're keeping that separate, if you remember, because that was a separate bid package. And you can see at 1.1 million, leaving us with a grand total of $3.75 million. So again, not in any kind of priority order, but just kind of as determined in our discussions with the working group and getting to this point. So right now, we'd be sitting at 3.75 million for recommended alternates to be included. Just to make sure everybody's clear, the recommended alternates to be excluded. So things we have talked about in the past that we are not moving forward with. Construction of a ball field at 1 million, and then there's some conversations we have had about abatement and demolition of some areas of existing high school per demolition drawings. This was and we can get our architects to provide more detail on this if there's additional questions, but it really just didn't apply to us at this point. So that's that $396,000 that we're excluding, that we're not moving forward with. So we just want to make sure you're very clear on how we're getting to our recommended amount. So we've now seen two numbers. We've seen an overage amount, and we've seen an recommended ad alternate list amount. And this is what we look at. So there's our base bid amount over budget at 5.9, the tennis courts at 1.1, the recommended alternate list moving forward at 2.5, at a total of 9.684 million. So that's kind of the process or the financials or kind of the total dollars that we're looking at. So, Kat, do you want to kind of give us this last view of reimbursement rate?
Yep, we just wanted to highlight the importance of the increased reimbursement rate before Meg makes a formal recommendation from the building committee. So as we mentioned, we did receive an additional $14.7 million in state grant funds by an increased reimbursement rate to 30%. The only way for the project to utilize the additional $14.7 million is to hold another referendum. And with this additional appropriation that's being recommended of $9.7 million, the net municipal costs to Farmington taxpayers will be less than what was anticipated at the June 2021 referendum. So in June 2021, the anticipated net municipal cost was $109.3 million, whereas today the net municipal cost would be $104.3 million, so still less than what we had anticipated originally. So I'll turn it back over to Meg for the formal recommendation.
Okay, so, as I mentioned, this was the conversation in our building committee last week. We walked through each one of these options, the rationale behind each, had some very deliberate conversations. So as a representative of the building committee this evening, this is our recommendation to the town council on next steps. So the Farmington High School Building Committee recommends that the town council recharge the Farmington High School Committee to prepare for a second referendum vote to appropriate $9.7 million in order to utilize the additional $14.7 million in reimbursement from the state of Connecticut to address the overages in the trade packages and alternates as a result of cost escalation and restore the project to what was voted on at referendum by including alternate numbers 1, 2, 3B, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, and the tennis courts.
Okay. I will now open up to questions from the council, keeping in mind we have not had any discussions on the financial forecast. We'll be doing that next. But if anyone has questions for Megan and the building committee. Rafina, go ahead.
You know, my hand's always up. First of all, thank you to everyone on the building committee, to Meg especially, for coming and presenting to us. So I have to tell you, a lot of people were kind of taken aback. Some of us are still listening to your talks regularly and your meetings. So there are a couple of things. There are a lot of numbers being thrown around. But if you could say it one more time, procedurally, we are required to go out to referendum to be able to access the additional $14 million from the state of Connecticut. Is that correct?
I want to make sure that I say this correctly. What I understand to be true is that we cannot spend any more than $135.6 million. We
Right.
are not authorized to do that.
But because we got the extra state funding, and we would like to utilize that extra state funding, that necessarily makes our total project costs increase, correct?
The top level number, yes, would
Right.
increase, correct?
But the net municipal cost to the town would actually decrease because now we have access to the $14 million.
Based on what the slide that Kat just presented, which talks about the June number and the October number from 109.3 to 104.3
Okay,
net municipal.
all right. So again, we are increasing the top level number, the entire cost of the project. However, that is sort of set off by this additional funding from the state.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Because that's a really hard thing as we go forward to communicate, and that'll be the hardest thing. And I'm really waiting with bated breath to hear about Joe's numbers and what that really means to the taxpayers, as we all are, because and I know, we all stood here and we, as a town, voted to have the school built. And I do respectfully disagree with Mr. Kelly. A lot has happened to the ground. That was not a flat piece of land. I can tell you, I've gone up there. And I feel like if we stop right now and throw our hands up and say we can't do this project, this would be terrible for our town and for our children. So I applaud your efforts, and I hope that we can all come together again and say, okay, things have changed. How do we move forward? And I think this is exactly what we are doing and starting the process right now. So that's all I got.
Thank you. Other questions? Keith?
How are you?
Good.
Thank you, and Johnny as well. The building committee is proud, and everybody on the building, it's like the most rigorous volunteer committee that we've had the past years, so thank you. Couple of questions. The number, the 5.9 to settle up, excluding the ad alternates, where's that number coming from? Because that's an estimate at this point, because we don't have the bids for it yet, correct?
No, that's the bid numbers.
Those are the bids numbers,
Yes.
okay. Second question, or I guess this is a longer one. The ad alternates, I don't know if there's someone that can speak to each of them. So my concern with the ad alternates is that at some point in the process, you guys decided that they were not essential and that we did not need them. And so to go back and say that's something that we had decided that we don't need, we need now. I'm in favor of anything that we need and to get the school that we voted for, but I want to be convinced, I guess, on each of those items before we just, open up the checkbook, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and, I think I want to make sure our language is clear in the fact that, some of the things that you actually see in that list were part of the educational specifications and things that came forward as requirements to us that we had to make some really difficult cuts on. So from a district perspective and from a Board of Ed perspective, they were required in a lot of respects, and we just had to say, we can't do it because of the cost and trying to contain that cost. Probably the district is better prepared to say for each one what the value is And we can certainly, we've been in enough conversations, but I think Kathy and Scott can probably talk better too.
Yeah, I just think it would be, to go out to referendum, because the one thing I disagreed with was on the cons list for going to referendum. There is a con, and the con is that the citizens will be frustrated by this whole process. And so to just, without explanation, have these things added in, I think it would be helpful to have people say, you know, what are we getting out of wood ceilings and this partition and other things like that?
Yeah, I think that's we went back and forth on understanding pros and cons and risks and how we applied them to each of these. And, you know, what we were looking at is what was the overall, what is the concept?
No, I understand where
of
you're
the
coming from. I didn't mean to quibble with your thing.
No, I just want to make sure we
went back and
certainly-
forth.
We really did, because
Yeah.
this is not, we don't come to you lightly, certainly with this,
Yeah.
this recommendation. And the due diligence hopefully came through of our analysis of the work and the work that has been done to date. But, you know, we also know that this is a way for us to get the project to better represent the project that the community really did vote on. So, you know, we felt that was the most responsible ways to put that on the table for consideration. So, I think, Kathy, I don't know, do you want to talk a little? I think it's a good question about the ad alternates.
It's very interesting to be an educator talking about construction projects and having, I know, it's just, it's very exciting. I would say that, you know, my perspective on any project that we do when it comes to construction is making sure that we're creating a project that is, number one, really easy to maintain for our custodians, because we try not to add FTE to our budget. And when we have a project that creates a situation where it's more difficult to clean a particular school or a particular renovation, or in this case, a new building, that's something that I think about as superintendent. I also think about the longevity of the products that we're using in our buildings, because they have implications for our taxpayers long term. The third and most important thing that I think about is programmatic improvements and enhancements, flexibility for the future. I think we've learned many lessons from having the building we have up on the hill right now that doesn't have a lot of flexibility, to a building like Westwood's that has a lot of flexibility in the way that it was constructed, very large hallways, lots of smaller rooms for small group instruction, as well as regular classrooms, and things like having a cafeteria that also can serve as an auditorium. You know, so those are some examples at Westwoods that we've learned many lessons from. So when we look at the ad alternates and we look at kind of a priority, the first item, which is the wood ceiling, and that is something that we have at Westwoods. It's something that brings a lot of warmth to the building. When you walk in, it makes it a lot more homey for our kids when they walk in and they feel like, you know, this is a place where I feel at home, and I feel that it's not just a lot of white walls and white ceilings, that type of thing. But it also has longevity. It doesn't require a lot of maintenance. And so it is something that is, you know, our top priority as far as the way in which the building looks when you walk in, and how our students will experience that building over time. A building has also a lot to do with students' social, emotional well-being. So we really do want it to be a building that students walk into and right away feel at home. The operable wall, the partition between the gymnasiums, that's something that was in the ed specs, and there are a few reasons for that. That the operable wall will enable us to open up both gymnasiums. The gymnasiums are adjacent to each other, and we can open that up for a lot of flexibility, and you'll hear me talk about flexibility a lot. This building the whole design is designed for flexibility for the future. Education changes, it shifts over decades, and we want a building that will shift with the changes in education. So the first is it really will allow our health and PE teachers to engage in classes together or separately, depending upon the needs of that particular lesson, that particular unit of study. Health and wellness has become a significant priority, much more of a priority than it has been in the past, and I would think as we look towards the future, it will continue to be a top priority for our students. It allows for district-wide events. Currently, we have a K-12 choral event, K-12 art event, K-12 orchestra event. We haven't had those in the last couple of years, but we're looking forward to going back to those. I will say that not all family members can come, and we often have issues with the occupancy when we have those K-12 events, and so it can be very difficult for our students, too, to be in such a crowded area when they're performing, and to be able to open up both those spaces will allow for a lot more attendance and comfort for our students while they're performing or exhibiting their artwork. It allows for future district-wide events. We are a district that really believes in exhibitions of learning for our students where they can display what projects they're working on, whether it's a final project or a project that is on its way to being finalized, and that really aligns to our vision of the global citizen. We have capstone and aspire demonstrations. That's our mastery-based projects that are required for graduation. Indoor graduation is always something that we worry about, and if you've had a child who's had an indoor graduation, you know that one gym is not large enough for that, and this would allow us to have participation for more family members in graduation, and I think it's really a future vision for our school district, knowing that that's a reality. I also think that other schools could use this space, that other schools within our school district for various events or promotion ceremonies. It also allows for future regional activities, athletic state competitions, wrestling tournaments. I'm a wrestling mom, so I always think of that. It allows for future townwide events, speakers, PTO events, receptions that might connect to other activities within the school. It just allows more flexibility also because we have to use our high school sometimes for a shelter, and that would give us a lot more sight lines when it comes to utilizing both gymnasiums for that purpose. It can be a revenue source in the future for the school districts, for the potential for events that would serve as that revenue source. And we have some examples of those things within our district right now. And programmatic enhancements. Rather than limiting our programs, it really opens up our programs up at the high school for whole school activities, and also for more like co-teaching and collaboration between disciplines, whether that's robotics and being able to set up our robotics programming there, our sports activities, physics demonstrations. Often those are out in the hallway right now. We would love to be able to have this space for that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, exhibitions of learning, whether it's school or district-wide, and we'll see lots more of that in the future. On the third item, the ground face CMU, that is really a maintenance issue, and we really do, this would give more of a stone type facade to the walls, and we know that high school students can be rough on the facility, and that would just create less maintenance for the future if we were to have that. Porcelain tile is very similar to that. It's a maintenance issue. We are right now experimenting with some of the newer linoleum tile and having some challenges. So West District just got new flooring, and we're using this product. It has been challenging for us, both installation and maintenance. So with the porcelain tile, we've seen this over in Guilford, and it's very low maintenance and something that we're interested in including in the project. Operable windows to the exterior curtain wall. I believe this, right now, none of the windows are operable, so we would have one in each area that would be operable. And then soffits in the stairwells under the stairs and landings. I think this is, a look that would be something that we are interested in keeping there. There's an elevator 3 in area E. So there were some, as we were doing value engineering, there were some changes we had to make design-wise, and which would require, potentially would help if we had a third elevator. Basically, the elevators are on one side of the building And this would be on the direct opposite side of the building, and I think it would be, a lot more ease, not only for our custodians getting things up to the second floor or bringing things down to the first, but also for our students who are in need of elevators to get to from one floor to another. And then one exterior horizontal sunshade, also per window. I think we felt like that was a very important energy element to the project. So that's, an overview. Obviously, tennis court is also a programmatic impact. We have an outstanding tennis team, 2 outstanding tennis teams, and we really think that that would be important to have up at the high school. Anything that's off-site has transportation implications and additional costs to the district long-term and the town. And so having the tennis courts on that site it would be important for our interscholastic programming. So any questions?
Questions on the options? Brian, you look like you're about to leave.
Not on the options.
Okay.
I do.
Go ahead, Joe.
On the operative wall for the gymnasium. So if there is no operative wall, is it an open space? Are you putting a solid wall up?
It's a solid wall that would not have the engineering to easily do that later. So it's basically making a choice that would be much more expensive in the future if we thought in the future, boy, that really would have been important to have that operable wall, and we're really needing it at this point. And Scott, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I would add, I had questions about it. I'm used to, old school operative walls that you may have seen. Irving Robbins has one. So Kathy, myself, Matt Morelli, we actually visited the school that utilized the type of operable wall that we're looking at for the high school, and it's an incredible technology and piece of equipment that you kind of had to see it to believe it in terms of, I was in a school that had a full cafeteria. They used it to separate, it was their gymnasium, their cafeteria, and their auditorium stage. They had 2 of them. They had one for their auditorium, so they had their band practicing on the stage with an operable wall closing off the stage. They had a full basketball game going on in the gym, and they had a cafeteria full of kids. And from one room to the next, you wouldn't know that something, unless you put your ear next to the wall, you can definitely tell there's some activity going on there. But high quality product, and again, for us, something we felt was really important once we saw it, to get into that vision of having the flexibility, having the ability to utilize it programmatically, athletically, for community events. It's something that if you don't do now, likely will never be in the cards again. So, and it came in much less than we thought it would be. So I really didn't think it would be an option based on seeing it and understanding what the projected cost was, which was, my understanding, close to double.
Do you know how big the auditorium is?
It's for half the population.
Number?
So it's for population, it's 14
Mm-hmm.
So we can accommodate roughly 7 students.
So half the entire school's population, not the high school's population.
The
Okay.
high school population.
So Richard Sivek with
Yep.
Guest Taking. I didn't introduce myself. So that's the maximum number of seats that the state of Connecticut will reimburse. If you go to a bigger auditorium, they will not pay for that, but they consider it excess seating. That's why that number is.
Great.
Is it 12? I'm trying to remember from the SFEX, is it 12,000 square feet for the gym, the one gym, and then the gymnasiums? That's what you're asking.
He was asking.
Oh, you were? I had gymnasiums on the mind,
They switched
sorry.
from operable wall to the
I did switch,
auditorium.
unfortunately. I'm just trying to think of capacity as you're talking about
Yes.
events and this. Just wondering, do we have extra seating as a bigger auditorium? So if there was an indoor graduation or an event, would both areas be able to utilize
I-
it?
I
The
think
and the auditorium
even-
extra like we've done in the
I would say even with the operable wall, because we have such high attendance at a graduation with extended family, we would always use the auditorium if we ran out of space in the 2 gymnasiums, if we had the operable wall. That would always be something that we would use, again, as a flexibility, but You are right that it's half the population, and that's what the state allows for when it comes to the auditorium.
Okay. I have others, but I'll let everybody else go. I can wait for, to go around the loop.
Actually, does anyone have, why don't we go down sort of the list and see who's got questions on the different items, since we've got a whole list here. Why don't we just start from the top? Any questions on the wood ceiling from anyone in here? Okay. Operable wall.
Just one?
Go ahead, Brian.
Is there just one wall?
Yes. Just one wall between the two gyms.
What is the size of each of those gyms compared to what we have now?
So you have a full gymnasium with enough seating capacity to house the entire population. You don't have that capacity. You also have an auxiliary gym, which will allow a full basketball game to occur, plus some spectators on the side of the gymnasium. You don't have that capacity now. You'll have the ability to have a tournament occur in your facilities, but you don't have that ability right now.
And is that with,
Richard, why don't you come up and sit at the table, and then you can use the microphone, so then our microphones aren't so loud.
Wasn't me.
Keith didn't do this, huh? We can turn the volume down just a little bit.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
A lot of it. That's a lot better. So the gymnasium, we're talking about two different spaces with a wall. When the wall is closed, the one gymnasium then is capable of taking the full population
Correct.
and/or a state event.
That's correct.
Okay.
If the wall opens, and that wall opens vertically,
Mhm.
and it's designed that way so that you don't need any stack space for the wall panels, which if you open them horizontally, then you impinge on the space, the play area. But if it opens vertically, you have a clear field house practically. And you'll be able to have 3 basketball courts at the same time, one in the auxiliary gym, and either one main basketball court in a main gymnasium, or 2 cross courts. So you could have 3 courts that would be oriented the same way, north-south. So you could have several games going on at the same time. One more thought, if I could share, about the operable wall. The operable wall, when we were asked to design for it as a possibility, we asked if there's an acoustic requirement, because that also affects cost. And there is an acoustic rating on this operable wall. It's not a cheap wall. And it's also suspended from up above, so what you heard previously, we do have to modify the structure to support that operable wall. That's what all adds to the cost.
What is the acoustical element to that? I mean, I know it's sound deadening, I understand acoustic. But what is the difference if you had one with or without the acoustic rating?
What's the cost difference? I'm
Yeah.
afraid I don't know the cost.
Okay, how big a sound difference is it?
I believe its rating is 56 decibels. That's the reduction in
Okay.
noise.
And is the thought to be able to perhaps do music performances in that space by lifting up the operable wall and having, for example, a concert or a Northern Regional, the orchestra and the bands do that, and we have to travel all over the district to be able to not only audition, but also for the regionals themselves?
Yeah, I believe you could have a musical event on one side without any difficulty.
So that could occur without the wall being raised?
No.
Well,
On one side
with the-
or
He's
not?
saying, yeah.
If
With the
you
wall
are
raised.
having 2 events happening on each
Yeah.
side of the wall,
Okay.
you really do need the wall
Right.
not to interfere. The primary consideration was to have athletic events on each side and not have the athletes on one side hear whistles or bells or anything that could affect their performance. It wasn't really thought of as a musical separation. I mean, if you have a marching band, it may be more difficult to dampen that noise than if you had,
Band mom right here.
okay. It would be more difficult than if you had a strings event, for example.
Right.
I'm afraid you'd have to try it and then decide whether it's achievable with only the wall or whether it's then the scheduling.
Right, so is this similar to in Guilford, when, like years ago, when we visited the high school there? They did have an operable wall, and they were able to partition, and then you lifted it up, and it was huge open space. And
Yes.
it was used for all sorts of things, including musical performances, I believe.
Well, the operable wall in Guilford, we designed that project as well. The operable wall in Guilford in the main gym is not an acoustic separation.
Okay.
It's only to create separate athletic events. And so that you'd have two basketball events or two practices going on at the same time. The auxiliary gym is separated with a permanent wall. They do not have an operable wall separating the auxiliary gym from the main gym. This actually would be an operable wall instead of a permanent wall.
Well, I like the idea of having multiple events at the same time and just not being able to hear. I understand the band. My daughter's the bass drummer, so yes. We're not going to get rid of that noise anytime soon.
We did visit, there were, the cafeteria was happening, it was lunch period, and then there was a PE class, and we could not hear, if you went on one side or the other, you couldn't hear. So it was very impressive for us, because we did not think it would be that soundproof, that level of soundproofing, but we experienced it.
I had skeptical expectations going on the visit and was more than pleasantly surprised by the quality of the product. And to answer your other question, the idea would be to host regional events so what you're asking, I think, is can you make the gym larger so that you can host
Yes.
multiple schools? That is what we're thinking. Or, again, our district-wide, which happens every year at the high school, being able to accommodate more guests and more family and friends and things like that to the event by creating a larger flexible space.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other wall questions?
Is the wall currently in the ed spec?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to preface this by every question I ask, I pretty much know the answer to it. I feel like it's good that we get it out there. The one that we haven't talked about much, the current high school, to my knowledge, had an operable wall at one point. And it was taken out, and I don't know the dates on that, because we didn't get into the old school at this point. We've been talking about the new one. Do you guys have any information on that wall and why it was removed, or at what time frame? Or is this so far back that flexibility really wasn't something we were considering at that time?
You're saying in the large gym there was a wall?
That's what I understand. Then.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that our health and PE teachers would say is this: if it can't be a soundproof wall, that does present issues when you're talking about physical education events, athletic events. That is a challenge. I think what's different today is that it's different technology, and it's a game changer when it comes to having that wall have soundproofing that allows for two events to go on without it interrupting the other event. So that I don't ever remember a time where there was an operable wall in the large gym, but I know from being in education that I remember seeing that, and the challenge was always that it was just too loud on both sides for it to actually be effective.
Thank
So
you.
that was before my time as well. However, Irving Robbins is a good example of a school with an operable wall. They're using it right now because thank you for the capital support there on the cafeteria, which is coming along nicely, but they use it for a makeshift cafeteria, and so they utilize it. The most common kind of operable walls you see is something like that. And the reason schools refrain from using those is because they take time and labor to set up, and they're a bit cumbersome as you're pulling them out and trying to get all the pieces to align. And so oftentimes schools will invest in that, and then when they realize the labor intensity that it takes to get those set up, they tend over time to not use those. Or the other ones are kind of like the roll down sheets, which are really used to separate the same event happening in a space as well. But again, this is something that put a key in, flip it up, and it takes a matter of minutes or so to go up and down. So
It's an operable wall. It's not a partition, right? Like those things, those like accordion partitions that are everywhere. So it's an actual wall. Tony already knew that.
Thank you.
Okay. The next item, are there any questions? I believe that's cinder block instead of sheetrock?
Cinder
let-
block is not a correct term.
Okay, sorry.
CMU is concrete masonry unit.
Gotcha.
Cinder block is no longer used in masonry.
Okay.
But people still call it cinder block, I don't know why. But ground-faced concrete masonry unit is a polished masonry product that has aggregate in it that when it's polished, it's exposed, so it has some color to it. Because it's polished, it's resistant to graffiti. You never have to maintain it other than maybe occasionally wiping it down. So it's an extremely durable product, resistant to impact. We've used it many times in projects. It does cost more than a gypsum board partition, which, as you know, needs to be painted quite regularly.
And patched, I'm sure, as well,
And
so with the
it's vulnerable.
kids bouncing off the walls.
Correct,
So,
it's vulnerable to it.
great.
Yeah.
Any questions on that item on here?
Where would that be placed, all throughout the school? Is this in certain areas?
This would be in the main concourse, which is a two-story space, and it would have, so it is all along the corridors where you have people walking.
So we're talking about 5 foot high off the ground, 10 foot high from floor to ceiling?
It's from floor to ceiling.
Porcelain tile, any questions on the porcelain tile?
Just to clarify, that's
Yeah.
in the common areas, right? The classroom wings and that would not be porcelain tile.
No.
We're trying to get the high traffic areas.
Right, the high-traffic area, which would be, again, in the main concourse, the main place of traffic all day long. It's also would be in the cafeteria. So porcelain tile is more durable than the next floor tile, which would be linoleum tile. So again, it's extremely easy to maintain. All it needs is to be damp mopped, and it looks great.
And on a practical level, you don't get those little black marks from all the treads in the kids' sneakers,
That's correct.
just to bring it down to my level.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are the kinds of decisions we've talked about, the questions we've talked about with the committee, because the long-term maintenance of it is a factor. I mean, if it takes less time to maintain, costs less money in the long run.
Right. Operable windows, any questions on the operable windows?
So,
Wait,
this,
any questions
oh,
from,
sorry,
Oh, yeah.
no,
Each classroom, all levels?
all spaces along the perimeter of the building, whether they're classrooms, offices, meeting rooms,
So,
all the perimeter.
so how does this affect our building security by
So-
having open windows in a time of crisis?
Yeah, we did talk about that as well. There were security task force meetings in which we talked about that. It is not a problem. It is something that you can lock and
Or open?
open, right? But you can only open it from the inside. You can't open it from the outside.
Correct. So, like I say, unfortunately, if it'd be an inside threat, someone can open a window, allow somebody else in, or to gain something.
Well, that is one of the trade-offs. I mean, if you want to have fresh air, let me step back. We have a mechanical system in the entire building that provides between 5 or 6 air changes per hour. It's a lot of ventilation, and it's all filtered air. However, there's still the need for some people to want to open a window if they feel, despite the mechanical ventilation, they need to get fresh air circulating. So this is something that we talked about during staff meetings, and there was a high percentage of staff members who did want operable windows. So this became an alternate. And if you can afford it, I would recommend that you do the operable windows to give those people who have that need to have the opportunity to open the window.
But again, like you said, we'll have state-of-the-art airflow and everything else within the school already, so it's
Correct.
just a matter of an old habit or.
How do those windows open? I remember,
They're awning, so they
So
have a
they
cam
open.
opening and then they open up.
okay.
good point. I hear voices in the background. And one of those voices said, is there a limit? In other words, a stop on the window? Yes, there is. So you can't open out fully. It comes to a stop, and I think it's about 8 inches.
Okay. The stairwell soffit, this is sheet rocking under the stairwells?
Right, so we recommended
Hold
that.
on, Richard. Any questions up here? We're going to questions up here first.
Sorry.
Any questions on the sheet rock underneath? See, we can skip right over that one then. Got no question. I'm saving you time. Elevator number 3. I know something, there you go. I know we had a question on that one.
So for the elevator number 3 in area E, could you say that that also relates to ADA accessibility for students that may be in a wheelchair or temporarily injured and using crutches?
So, yes and no. It is a way to address ADA by allowing the third elevator to serve the music area. We have the music and the backstage area, and those spaces are divided between the first floor and the second floor. So elevator number 3 is for that particular area, so that the communication between the first floor students and teachers can easily go to the second floor and use music spaces on the second floor, or music offices on the second floor. They can use elevators number 1 and number 2 to go from both floors, but they're at extreme far distances from the music area. The music area is on the western side of the building. The other 2 elevators are on the eastern side of the building, across the atrium space. So while technically you can, to satisfy ADA, you can use any of the elevators, there are some people who would say, and we engage the services of a universal design consultant who looks above and beyond ADA, which is, from their perspective, that isn't enough. You have to allow students and other people in the building the most convenient path to an elevator. So if you are discriminating and not allowing the same people who are disabled to have that same kind of convenience of a nearby elevator as able-bodied people who can use the stair in that location, then that's a discrimination. It's a judgment call, and that's why it became an alternate. I think it's easier to defend against any ADA complaints if you include the elevator, and I think you're better served by including that elevator.
So it does help with ADA, but it also serves the purpose of more efficient mobility.
Yes.
Throughout the building into the areas you were describing.
Yes.
And is it also for the transportation of, for example, instruments?
Yes.
Okay.
If I can go back to that, to me, it sounds almost like, is it a design flaw, knowing that you have a band area and now you're separating it between floors? Why not just keep everything on one floor?
We talked about that a lot as well. And we had to do some value engineering. This was something that the chair of the building committee brought up a few minutes ago. We had those discussions, and in order to accommodate all of the music area on one level, we would have to push the building perimeter out 7 feet. That 7 feet amounted to about $1.7 million in additional cost, because the footprint of the building would be bigger. It's much more efficient to stack those spaces and reduce the perimeter of the building.
Other questions on the elevator? No. The horizontal sunshades, questions on those?
I'll throw one out there.
Go ahead.
So just to clarify, we removed 1 out of the 3. So there's 2 currently there, and I guess the best way to explain this is to get into that, a little bit into the passive energy and the sunlight. If you want to explain what that third one and what that benefit would be.
Sure, I need to correct that. There's actually 2 horizontal sunshades. And in some cases, we have vertical sunshades as well. But we're only talking about the 2 horizontal sunshades that are at the top of the windows. This alternate it was a question of can we remove one of them and save some money? Yes. And that would leave one, horizontal sunshades. But it does have an impact on solar gain and the additional demand on cooling. So typically, what we would like to do is to put one sunshade that's about 3 feet wide to cast a 3-foot deep shadow on the window. This was a way to get that same effect by using 2 shorter horizontal louvers, one casting 1.5 feet shadow and another casting 1.5 feet shadow. That's typically what we would like to achieve. So the trade-off here is if we eliminate one of the horizontal sunshades, it would reduce the shadow that's cast, it would increase the solar gain, but it saves some money. And so this is the struggle. If you want to save some money, you have to make these kinds of decisions. But I think it's a compromise, and if you can afford it, I would recommend you keep both.
Is that just for the south side, or is that for the entire building?
So we have also vertical sunshades. So typically on the western side, you would have vertical ones. On the southern side, you would have horizontal ones. So we have a combination of horizontal and vertical.
On all, or just in particular areas?
On all.
So even on the north side of the building, we would have these?
On the north side, we have very few windows, and I'm not sure that we have horizontal sunshades on the north side.
But just to clarify, I know you're talking about 1 and 2. We currently have 1 sunshade built into the project. What we're asking for now with this additional funding would be to get the second and therefore sort of recoup some energy so we wouldn't have to spend as much in air conditioning costs potentially.
That's correct.
Okay.
Any other question on sunshades? Any other question on alternates in general?
Tennis courts.
Oh, yeah. Tennis court questions. We've got that as an alternate. You want to describe the tennis courts and
So this is,
thinking behind it?
in essence, as you see the space up there now, if you've had an opportunity to go up and view the work that's been done in early enabling, you can see how the positioning of the tennis courts as they exist today will need to obviously change. And one of the things that we were tasked as a building committee was to look very strongly on making sure that we do our best to keep the facility and the amenities that go with that in kind, right? So obviously we have tennis courts there today. Our requirement was provided to us by the Board of Ed was to make sure that we include those tennis courts as well. And we really deliberated. This is a very tough one for us to even have on the list at all, because we know the importance of this for not only the school and the programming within the district, but also as a community asset. But when we had to look at cost overall and what we could do that wouldn't impact the building structure, we were trying to look at site improvements, we were trying to look at other assets on the property. And what we said is, here's a way for us to understand what the cost of tennis courts are and what that means to us and we bid that out separately, you can see, so we can see a cost there, and being able to figure out a way for us to build that back into the project if we could. So it would be basically replacing tennis courts in kind back onto the property. That's what this cost is for, obviously in a different location. And that's something that we would discuss later on in the project as we move forward. But we clearly know the importance of this to the project, to the community, and know that it's something that we would really like to recoup and put that back into the project if we're able to.
Great. Any other questions on tennis?
So
Comments?
during the next couple of years while we're constructing, obviously we don't have any. So what is the process for the tennis team currently, and are they being bussed? How are they practicing? How are they doing? And I'm gonna get this wrong. It's not a meet,
It's
a match.
There you
It's
go.
a match.
I got corrected last time.
Tennis guy, Johnny.
But if you could just take us through that a little bit and how that process works.
I've been talking for years, is that okay for everyone?
Sure. Just state your name so everyone hears you.
Scott Hurwitz, former principal at the high school, current assistant superintendent, finance operations. So it is a challenge in this community in particular. I think it screams the need for tennis courts. We have been challenged by that. We've reached out to some private facilities in town. We do have a set of tennis courts that we will be able to utilize, albeit smaller than what was pre-existing at the high school, and that's at Irving Robbins. The town and the parks folks have been very helpful as we've needed to make some cleaning and improvements of those courts so that they're ready and suited to be used for a high school season. I'm not overly optimistic that we'll find a private partner that both meets our budget and the time that we need for high school tennis. So while it hasn't been finalized yet, the likely plan is that both tennis teams will share the Irving Robbins court and have to be transported up there to utilize that site. We would love to be able to have two separate courts so that we can have matches and practices and those things going on simultaneously like we had up there. But like you said, our athletic director and I have vetted several other options, and right now they're not viable. So for the time being, Irving Robbins would be both the best use for community and also for both of our tennis teams, and they'll likely have to alternate, times in which they're practicing to make sure both teams can get the court time there. We'll also have to, that's where baseball will also be taking place, aside from Tungsten Mead, baseball will also be happening at Irving Robbins, so we're hoping to, when possible, combine transportation to IAR for both of those sports.
So I can report that the tennis courts are actually up at IAR, because we were there just this past weekend, but there are only 4 courts. And at the high school, I think we have like 8 or something. So it is much smaller. It does look fantastic. The courts are up, but I mean, talk about elbows. You have to try and get there and stake your claim. So I think it will be very challenging, given the size of our tennis teams, to make Irving Robbins work. So I think it's incumbent upon us to get a tennis court at the high school when we get everything done.
One more question.
Yep.
Unless, no. So take us through the idea of doing this as a separate bid and how we originally did that. And more elaborate on the fact that, we kind of looked at this as one of the hardest cuts that we had. And how that would work on our reimbursement if we were to take a look at this in a capital project down the road, which is why it was separated. So you can kind of take us through that a little bit.
Yep. You want Laurel to just take it from a bidding perspective?
Sure. I'll transfer it to the complicated world of construction manager.
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion on how to deal with the tennis courts, and since they wouldn't be constructed for about 2 years, it was decided that if we do it as a separate bid package, we would ask them to hold their pricing for a certain amount of time. So their pricing is being held till like June or something of next year. But the idea is, since they're not being built until later, we wanted a separate trade package. Just to, again, it was same process as that value engineering where things were being actually taken away. The alternates, which were being separated, this was just another separation. It was just another means to getting the price. And depending on how the bids came in, it was whether or not we would be accepting the tennis courts as a trade package. But the preparation of the ground is all in the base bid. It's just the actual surfacing of the tennis courts themselves. It's a specialty contractor, so it's just that final finish is what that would be for. Does that answer your question?
Yes, part. And then the other part is, if we were to do this as a capital project, would we realize the reimbursement the same way we would if we were to incorporate this in the high school project?
Absolutely not. It would be you'd get the 30% if it's part of the project.
Okay. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Keith?
Scott, the baseball team and softball team, they've been playing varsity and JV games at Tungsten Mead forever, right? I mean, for a long time, and they practice at the high school, is that correct?
That's correct. Well, the need for softball, and then we've had the baseball fields at the high school previously, part of the construction site.
Yeah.
That was utilized by both freshman and JV baseball.
Okay, for their games, okay. I'm just wondering, just the impact on, because I think, you know, with tennis, you know, it sounds like baseball might be permanently, I mean, based on the cut on the next one where the ball field is excluded, just concerned about making sure athletics isn't given short shrift in general, you know what I mean? So something like the tennis court or whatever, I'm just curious how much of an impact that has on baseball, softball, everything else with all that transportation, the costs with transportation, and all that.
Yeah, you know, I think the other variable that's out here, which is another discussion, is the 28 building, right? And
Sure.
And,
Yep.
and what happens with that project, I sit on that committee as well, but,
Yep.
you know, that space from the 28 building and the space behind it, we've also learned, right, that the 28 building is comprised of what is now the current band room as well, so it kicks out a little bit in the back. And so if that project goes through, then, I'll let Richard speak to it probably, you know, but it's my understanding nearly impossible to get a baseball field or a ball field into that space. However, it would be great to have green space on the campus. I think that's a concern from the district as well, ensuring that, we don't eliminate, all of the green space. And so behind the 28 building, say the 28 building stays, and we'll still have green space back there, which will provide flexibility for, you know, other teams or space for students or the community to enjoy that has grass, and then who knows one day, right?
Yeah, and so-
It also has an impact on where the tennis courts go.
But then, yeah, on the other end too, with just looking at athletics, there's a big gain if that operable wall stays, right? I mean, to the usage for athletics and whatever else. So there could be potential trade-offs if one thing goes and one thing stays.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, I could go on and on. We have an indoor track team that exclusively practices outdoors, for the most part, during the winter months. You know, they'll do some hallways.
So say, we used to let them run around the hallway, I thought.
With the wrestling team, you know, everybody's, you know, fighting for hallway space, but again, you have an operable wall, you create some more practice time, and track can actually utilize an indoor space that replicates most of the other places they go around the state when they're having their meets and things like that. So, again, you know, there are some losses with this, right? We talk about baseball and the disruption to tennis for the time being. We all knew there was gonna be disruption, in the exterior, but the interior, we're thankful, we continue to operate as is. But those are some of the challenges we'll have to figure out as we move forward.
Thanks.
Maybe get an easier way to get across the river at some point to get over to the meet too. Would be
That's
helpful.
another night.
You don't want to, yeah.
I have to say, it would be exceptionally helpful at some point for our high school to get to our main off-site campus where most of our schools are.
The third north-south bridge crossing.
Fourth bridge.
Fourth bridge.
Mr. Geller, I got you.
The third north-south, the other one is east-west.
Yeah, got you. Yeah.
Just barely.
I have one more.
One more, Joe, go ahead.
Sorry to go back, but again with the operating wall. So the money that's there on the sheet here, is that for the mechanics in the wall itself, or does that include the infrastructure to build it, to support it, all that stuff?
It includes all of the infrastructure in construction. So we have additional steel at the roof to be able to support the operable wall. So this price is all in.
All in. What if we just, is there anything of you guys saying that just leaving it open, support it, but leave it open so it's one open space? Or if it's not there, you're closing it down? And just leaving a solid wall there if it's not an operating wall?
Right, the base design is just a solid wall.
I think programmatically, it would be necessary to have that, given that you have multiple activities during the school day, health and PE classes, multiple classes going on, or other activities, and then in the evening and afternoons, you're gonna want two spaces so that, you know, both your basketball teams can work simultaneously. And really, for every season, those gyms, we use those gyms constantly, and so having the ability to separate and have, you know, a basketball game and a wrestling match or wrestling practice and those things going on simultaneously, but then also, when the time arises, or to have a quad meet on the weekends or to host a tournament, you may, again, have the flexibility to do both.
I think Park and Rec, you know, they would also really benefit because they can use our gym spaces, and that would be something where they could get several games going on at the same time and utilize that. You know, that's another benefit.
Thank you.
Let me know when it'd be appropriate. I have questions going back to the rest of the presentation. I know we spent most of our time just on these alternates, but I do have things written down. I don't know when that would be appropriate.
Anything to do with the building committee's presentation, I would ask now, because after this, we're going to go on to financial forecast. We may still be circling back to building committee, so you don't get to leave after this.
All right, so one question, 18 parts. No, on the, I know Keith had alluded to this a little bit about the bids. Can you explain a little bit about there were 4 bids that came in that were single bids? And you corrected, Keith, it wasn't an estimate, we ran with the actual bid, but what those numbers were, and if there may be some potential savings that we could see when we do rebid this in the future.
So this bid result summary is kind of the high-level view. Oh, no, Laurel, I was just giving you a little intro as to what you're going to talk about, but when we say low bidders there.
Okay. I know it's hard to see, but just a flash, this is my list of trade packages. The red is representing the one bid, so. There were 4 particular trade packages where we only received one bid. One was miscellaneous metals, but when you totaled them, it was almost $2 million over our estimate. So we think that we can repackage them, clarify, rebid them, get more interest. When we were bidding this project again, just to remind, we were out to bid from August 31st. Our last bids were received the 19th. We've been out to bid for a while. It's not like we weren't out to bid long enough. It's just there's still a lot of competition. There was a lot of competition. We were right on the heels of Torrington. We were just behind them by 3 weeks. So we tried to avoid their bid as much as possible. That's why we kept extending it, but there were other projects bidding. So we're hoping that when things calm down, we will repackage them, put them back out on the street, and get more interest. So again, it's about $2 million over our estimate, so hopefully it will come down to closer to our estimate. So there's some savings that we are expecting there. It's just for our presentation, we just wanted to be, I don't know if you want to say conservative, but we just wanted to kind of show you the worst case scenario. That if something were to happen, because these are public numbers, these were publicly read bids, everybody knows the number. So then when you go out and rebid it, everybody's either trying to beat it or, somewhere around there. So we just want to try to cover the overage as best as possible.
So it could be in a land of like best case scenario with 3.9.
Correct. As the overage, yes.
So what happens if you go to rebid again and you don't get those numbers? Can you then rely on, your little circled red one where there was only one bidder?
No.
Is that the number?
No. Once that, we'd have to have the building committee reject the bids and then rebid. So those bids are moot. They're done. But there's nothing unusual about this project, why we didn't get that type of interest. It's just, again, I know people were busy. So I'm thinking about maybe 2 or 3 weeks when things calm down, go back out and hit the street again. So that's the idea with that. Excuse me?
What if the bids go up?
I highly doubt they'll go up that much since they're so far over, but hopefully they don't.
Well, I don't think we all intended to be having this conversation last year at this time.
Yeah, they're only representing about $2 million worth, so they're a very small chunk of the $115 million. It's a very small chunk that's left that we would be rebidding.
So to be clear, the estimates were somewhere around 1.1?
Yeah, or at 1.7 or somewhere there.
And where did the results come in?
About double it. It was just about double it, yeah.
And that double number, so in that 5.9 that you see on the screen, you carried the higher number?
Correct.
Even though we're looking to rebid that?
Correct.
And that is the number we have. That is the
Right.
true, that's the bid number we have at the moment. So rather than putting in the budgeted number,
Right.
we gave you, this is where we sit right now.
Right.
Based on the bids that we're carrying.
Okay, thank you. That was my,
Yeah. Does that help?
Yes,
And these are all real numbers. They're not estimates. They're all real numbers.
I got you.
One other thing,
Freedom.
sorry, just really quickly, for the uninitiated, if you go out to rebid in the next couple of weeks, will that delay the timeline at all?
No, they're not on the critical path.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a good question though, Rafina, and one of the things that you'll see, Laura highlighted those critical bid packages. Those were very important for us to make sure we understood, got out early and in front of, because of the fact that we do not, as I mentioned, we don't want to disrupt the timeline. Because the timeline is any extension in that, we start to look at increased costs. So it's one of the things we take a very close look at.
Right. Johnny?
Yeah, so my next question was on the estimator. I know you went through this, it was very quick. If you could just quick, a little bit more on how many times we went through estimates, how many estimators we had, and kind of that process we went through, because the criticism that I've received, not tonight, but in other places, that we, haven't done our due diligence and we maybe should have hired other estimators, but can you just take us through that process?
Sure. So there were 3 milestones, we'll call it, during design. There's different phases of design. And with every phase of design, Taisu Kim gives a deliverable. Taisu Kim Studios, the architect, gives a deliverable that we have professional estimators on staff. ONG has professional estimators. And Taisu Kim also has a cost estimator that they hire. Both estimators get the same documents. They're in their own, doing their own thing. They all come up with their own, they call it takeoffs. How many widgets are you counting? What's the price of the market? And then once the 2 independent estimators are done, we get together and we call it reconcile. How many of these did you carry? How many of those did you carry? So that you have 2 separate opinions on what the cost of the work is. And we try to get them to see the same project. They may not agree 100%, but at least kind of be close. And every time we did that, we were over budget. So started with the first estimate, we're over budget. What are we going to do? So the professional team will put together with input from everybody. Everybody was involved with input with what could we possibly do to reduce costs. Because don't forget, this was kind of going on over the whole COVID, how price escalation was going on. So we were constantly fighting the market in that respect. So with every estimate, we did that whole process. Come together, come to an agreement, this is what it's over, what are we gonna come down to? And every time the building committee put in that effort to figure out what are we gonna take out, and it happened 3 times. 1, 2, 3. So before we went out to bid, we thought we were gonna do great. Although we knew what was going on with the market, you hear it going on all around the state, how bids are coming in, bids are coming in, bids are coming in. Fingers crossed, just test the market, see where we're at, because time is of the essence, and this is where we are. So it's not, and so it's like, here we are again.
So that's a good lead into my follow-up question. So we did 3 different rounds with 2 different estimators that worked separately and then reconciled.
Correct.
Then we went out to bid completely for actual numbers.
Correct.
From what I understand, using the hard costs and where we are, we're about 4% over.
Correct.
And without getting into other projects, just we discussed at the building committee, other projects that you either ONG or CSG were working on, and where those percentages were coming in on average, and were they higher or lower?
They were higher. They were about double higher on average. And I can't speak for CSG, but I'm just speaking from our current recent experience.
That's correct. I mean, we've seen 3 projects come in the last, all bidding simultaneously or within the same time frame, and some of these other projects are coming in 8, 10, 11% higher. So it's hard to feel good about a $5 million number, but looking at Farmington, we were a little relieved knowing what was happening as these other, literally within weeks of each other, coming in. And so I would agree with the whole statement that these other projects were coming in double to the percentage increase that we saw here.
Right.
If anybody has follow-ups on estimates, then I have one more.
Go
that
for
I
it,
wanna
Johnny.
touch on. All right. And without getting too specific, because this isn't a discussion we've had in the building committee, we talked about option 1, we talked about option 2, we talked about option 3 going to referendum. And then if referendum fails, we are basically going back to visit a portion of 1 or 2, whatever that looks like. What kinds of items would we be talking about cutting at this point, since we've already looked at things like tennis courts and we've tried not to touch anything programmatic? et cetera, what types of items were thrown out there during discussion, although they haven't been evaluated, that that the town would be looking at in cuts.
Do you want me to answer that, or you want to? I mean, I was just, things that we're trying to obviously not affect programs, things I was thinking of was leave the temporary parking lot there. Don't take it out.
Which would, savings on the taking out of the parking lot, but would not allow the green space that we had be there before for javelin
Right.
or the concerts or things that we were using it before.
Right, or let the town take it out. Again, it's everything that we're talking about taking out, it's gonna have to be, there's a cost to it somewhere else. It's just, you're not paying for it right now. You're not doing it right now.
And if I recall, we discussed potential of not touching Monteith Drive and the double lanes and all the traffic backup that we're dealing with now and the improvements we're supposed to be making.
Right,
We talked about granite curbs versus concrete curbs and that savings, and then, granite curbs are forever, concrete curbs you're fixing every year, or
Right.
you're replacing them much sooner at a pretty good cost. So, I only bring that up because in the end, like, some of the other items that we never actually jumped into, we felt were too egregious, so we ended up with the list that we have now. And some of those other items would basically change the face of the project as the town had come out to bid for, to a referendum for to begin with.
Last thing, I
Rafina?
promise. Last thing. So, just to kind of bring it back, and I love that we've had just such a detailed discussion about all the things that were value engineered and taken out, and now we're potentially putting it back in. If we don't go to referendum, or rather, let me phrase that a different way. If we go to referendum and we fail at referendum, do we get the $14 million in state aid?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we're still spending the 135. We're just not spending.
However,
more
we
than that.
cannot access that money for this project.
Correct. The way the state gave us that money, unfortunately, we were not contacted by our reps before this bill went in. It was not given us in any way, shape, or form that we could use it for price escalation. One of the conversations throughout all this, with everything going on in COVID, was price escalation across the board. I think the numbers we saw here, there was a great fear they would be much worse when we were looking at some of the worst of it, and we were looking at some of the other schools that came in. But unfortunately, we were not asked what would be the best way to give us that money, so we actually could have used it for this project without going out to another referendum. So we could benefit the taxpayers, and that's what this does right now. It reduces from what we were originally talking about bonding, roughly 110 million, down to 95 million.
Right. I think you just teed it up for Joe.
Just about.
Well, can I just?
Go ahead.
I just,
Wrong Joe. but,
two-part, I'm sorry. Go to referendum, fails, does it disrupt the timeline for completion of project?
Our goal is to not do that. So
And
as,
s-
so just, that's why I kept saying from a
Yep.
risk perspective, we don't like our options, 1 and 2, but we will do that in order to move forward on the project, and the schedule will be maintained.
And to satisfy the comment, earlier public comment, what's the guarantee we're not back here in another year or two for another 10 million?
And I'll ask my professional partners to chime in on this, but what we're dealing with now is real numbers, right? It's not estimates, it's bids. We know what things cost, and we're applying those costs against the budget that we currently have. So from our perspective, this is our estimate. These costs are held, as Laurel mentioned, for us if we make our decisions accordingly in a timely fashion. So these are the cost estimates and what the project will cost.
And we'll never be back at this conversation again.
From our perspective, we don't see a reason why we would be back here based on the fact that we're dealing with real numbers in front of us versus estimates.
So the word I heard you use was guaranteed maximum price. So these bids are all in, they're solid for 90 days. And moving forward, we have actual bids and actual numbers that equal this number.
correct.
And the only way that this number can change is if we go out to bid on those 4.
Right.
And we are fairly confident we will save money, not come back.
Right.
And if for some crazy reason it was higher, we would then have to further cut at that point.
Right, you would have to do something to offset that, but it's considered, it's called a guaranteed maximum price, and the majority of the contractors all have bonds as well, so they're all bonded, so once we go into contract, if something happens, there's a bonding company that would be taking over, so once we lock everybody in, we're under contract, we're going.
And what's the end of the 90 days? What's the date?
She had around
January
January.
10th.
But obviously, I have 3 different dates, but starts with the
Yeah,
first one.
approximately.
October 6th.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we are good. Thank you for your presentation and all the work the building committee has done throughout this process. None of us expected to be here, but none of us expected COVID. None of us expected interest rates to change how they did or anything else is happening, so thank you.
Here as well, though.
Great, thank you.
Thank you both.
We will now move on to item D2, financial forecast. Joseph Swetke, our Director of Finance.
Okay.
Always get complaints that my graphs and charts are too small, nobody can see them on the board, so I gave you a visual aid. You may not want to see it, but. I don't remember the last time, well, I do remember the last time I did this. I don't remember how many of you were actually on the board, on the council when I made my last presentation. I think it was a pretty much different council. So let me go over a couple of things. For those who have heard it before, I apologize for the redundancy. Every year around this time, I put together a financial forecast, and usually it's just for the next couple of years, and looking at what the budget's going to look like for the upcoming year and possibly the year after that. And I do it for a couple of purposes. One is to obviously do the budget, and 2 is to project what the tax rate is going to look like, and 3 is to see what our debt situation is going to look like. When the high school conversation started back in 2017, I started expanding this to 5 years, and over the course of that time period, it actually grew to a 10-year financial forecast. Basically, what we do is I look at the history of the town. I've said this before, and I'll probably say it every time I do this. This town tends to repeat a lot of things. You're pretty stable and consistent in a lot of things you do. So doing some of the expenditure forecasting is not that, it's not that difficult. So we know based on history that this town has a history of, or a practice of giving the town and the board anywhere between, in the old days, 4% and 5%, and in the more recent 10-year history, in the 3% range for expenditure increases. The town has a problem, not a problem, the town has a practice, or had a practice of roller coaster debt issuance and roller coaster debt service. We've pretty much flattened that out over the past 12 years, made it more predictable. But still, the town's fairly consistent in doing that. Matter of fact, you're doing that now. So you are fairly consistent. The town also has a policy on capital improvements, and we try to adhere to that policy. You know, so much of our budget goes towards capital improvements, finding cash for capital improvements. So it's a pretty good number, easy number to project. So what you have in front of you is the financial forecast that was completed this October. It looks at, again, from my perspective, it looks at what the budget's going to look like next year. So you probably, when you look at this, you'll get a good idea of what your budget's going to look like for next year. Also, what I need to do for debt for the next year and for the next couple of years. In looking at this forecast, the first column is the adopted budget. The first column on the left says 22-23 adopted budget. And that's the budget that you adopted or you prepared last April. The voters approved at the end of April, and that's the budget that we're living in right now. And the one thing I would highlight there is, well, obviously, in my opinion, it was a good budget. You came in with a less than a 2% tax increase, and you added $2.3 million in high school debt. with that budget. It's the dark, if you look up in the high school issue of 2022, I want to make a correction there. I keep, and this is my fault, I keep telling everybody that we issued $40 million for the high school. We actually issued $37 million in change for the high school. We did issue $40 million in total, but there were some other projects, I was reminded, that were in there that did not relate to the high school. They related to other Board of Ed projects, into town roads, into some open space. So there was $37 million in change that we actually issued. We issued that at a 2.38% interest rate, net interest rate. And I just keep that in mind as we go through this forecast, that $40 million was issued in, we actually issued that in February, we closed in March, and the net interest rate was 2.38%. So you added almost $2.4 million in debt service, and you had a 2% tax increase. So it was a pretty good budget year. Going forward, I prepared the forecast this year, doing a couple of things that are probably, their assumptions are taking, I'm assuming things that may be on this forecast. One is there's been a lot of talk about the 1928 building. So in this forecast, I did plan, even though there's nothing in our budget for it, and even though there hasn't been a bond authorization for it, I did include in this forecast bonding in the outer years for a 1928 building. I did that at a $5 million rate. I'm not sure what your rate's going to be. I did hear talk based on the meetings I've attended. $5 million seemed to be a number out there. Also out there but is in the debt service number, the non-high school debt service number in those years is $3.4 million for ventilation projects for the elementary schools. And I based that on our capital budget. And let me back up a little bit. The capital budget, it was the basis for the debt service for the non-high school. So when you see those numbers there, I used the adopted capital budget. That has $3.4 million for the ventilation for the elementary schools. That has road projects, road bonds. That has a couple of fire trucks. It has fire station renovations, but not at the level that's in the capital budget. I actually dropped that number to $6 million as opposed to $11 million. So there are some assumptions in that number. And I just want to point out that number because it's going to be a key driver as we go out to the later years. So again, we'll start from the beginning. Education, I'm assuming going forward over the next few years, they're going to average about a 3.2% tax increase. That's actually slightly down from where it was in my last forecast. But again, this is not a static document. This actually goes based on history, and the most recent history is showing that their actual increase has been less than what we were forecasting before. So they're down to about a little over, just slightly below a 3.2% increase. Conversely, the town is just the opposite. The town we're now looking at, the town we were historically forecasting like a 2.99, 2.98% budget increase each year. Thanks to what you did last year for the town by adding money in at the last minute, you actually boosted that average up to a little over 3%. So going forward, looking at what the town's needs are for next year town's needs for next year are probably 5%, but the likelihood is based on history that will be around a 3% increase. And that carried forward going out. Board of Ed pensions, that's the contribution to the defined contribution plan for the non-certified Board of Education employees. That's one of our largest expenditures, growing expenditures. If you look at that, and it's been growing. We're projecting it's going to grow by about $75,000 to $80,000 a year for the next 10 years. And then the high school. The debt service for the non-high school projects. Again, that has some items built into it that are not included in the capital budget, but it also incorporates the capital budget. We have the 3.4 for the elementary school ventilation. We have $5 million for the 1928 building. We have a reduction in the renovations to the fire stations from $11 million down to $6 million. And we have bond issues assumed going almost every other year for road products of $2 million. So there's a lot of debt that we're looking at, non-high school debt, we're projecting going out, and based on our capital budget, based on the conversations we've been hearing at the council meetings. And if you look at that number, right now, for this year, we budgeted $6.9 million, and we're projecting a steady increase in that number. Next year, projecting that if all holds to course, we'll be at a $7.2 million. The next year after that, 7.4. And then 25, 26, we're going to jump to almost $8 million. So we'll go from 7.4 to $8 million, $600,000 in non-high school debt. In 26, 27, and beyond that, that number will pretty much stay up around the $8 million mark based on the capital budget and our bonding needs. So that number is going to go back up. It's been going down as our older debt falls off, but with newer debt coming on, we are going to go back up to that $8 million range. And that's always actually been a target of ours, was to keep stabilized debt service at the $8 million range. So it's not something that is necessarily bad at this point. It's something that we've, when we started doing these forecasts 10 years ago, that was one of the plans, was to always keep debt service at an $8 million number. So we'll be back at that number in a couple of years. The next item is the high school issue of 2022, which I mentioned before, so I'll skip that part. But that will start actually going down. We peaked at this year with the 2.3 million, 2,377,000, and obviously because interest, the interest will start going down. That number slowly will decrease over the next 20 years. That is a 20-year bond issue. So that actually helps you going forward. After that, I'm going under the assumption in this forecast that you're going to take advantage of some of those state reimbursement monies to do two things. One, to lower the net municipal costs, but number two, you're going to use some of it to cover what they've been talking about earlier this evening. I used a number of $10 million. So in other words, of the $14 million in state grant reimbursement, additional state grant reimbursement, I projected you were going to use $10 million of that, and that $4 million would go to reduce the net municipal cost. I know they're talking about 9.7, but quite honestly, when he's talking about numbers like this, a couple of $100,000 really doesn't move anything. Really, to move anything, you're talking in increments of $5 million. So really, $300,000 difference isn't really going to change a tax number. It's not going to change a bonding number. And the other thing, quite honestly, it's a lot easier for me to do a debt service schedule at a $10 million number as opposed to a $9.7 million number. It's kind of a pain to break up 9.7 into 20 digits or 20 increments. So at any rate, so I used $10 million. So again, $10 million would go back into the project. $4 million would go to reduce the net municipal costs. So your net municipal costs at that point would then become 65. We'd have to issue an additional $65 million. Is basically, we got the roughly $40 million. We would do another $65 million. And actually, again, we're doing this based on round numbers. It won't be perfect. It may be $66 million, and maybe $64 million. But again, just for the sake of this presentation, we use $65 million. It was projected doing that in three bond issues. And based on the way that everything's flowing right now, the cash flow, initially, the last time I presented this to the council, we talked about bond issues in January of each year. And right now, based on the way cash is flowing out, we're probably talking about bond issues in April or May of each year. So we're actually going to gain a couple of 60 days, maybe 90 days on each one of our issues. So there was that change in the whole bonding schedule and the debt service schedule. The issues, again, because we front-loaded the first issue, if you remember previously we had talked about we were going to do $20 million, a $45 million, a $25 million, and then a cleanup issue at the end. And because we knew interest rates were going up, and we doubled up the first issue for the $37 million instead of doing $20 million. And that changed what we would do issuing for the next three debt issuance. So now we're looking at a debt issuance of $23 million, our next one, $25 million, and then a cleanup issue, probably be around $17 million or you know, $17 to $20 million, depending upon where we were, where we are at the end in terms of what we need for dollars. So that's where we're at. The forecast on those debt issues is where the disturbing news comes in. Like you heard tonight, inflation has impacted debt, it's impacted finances, and what it's actually done is it's because the Fed is really going after inflation, because the Fed is raising interest rates rapidly. Right now, the most recent bond sale that I saw for a town in the state of Connecticut, 20 years, $8 million, their interest rate was 3.95%. Okay. We did one 8 months ago for 2.38%. That's how quickly rates have gone up. Rates, the Fed is forecasted to do another 0.75% increase in another couple of weeks, I guess next week, November 2nd. They may do another increase in December, probably not 0.75%, but probably in the 0.5% rate. What this means is that our interest rates that we originally forecasted, and I'll give you an idea of what we originally did. The original forecast said that the first rate, first issue would be a 2.75. We did 2.38. Second issue would be a 2.85. We're forecasting now a 4.15. The third issue, we forecasted a 2.95% interest rate. We're forecasting a 4.25% interest rate. And then the fourth issue, we projected a 3.05% interest rate. And I'm sorry, we originally forecasted 3.05. Now we're looking at, again, like a 4.25%. So as you can see, interest rates are at least a percentage point higher than what we originally had thought. What that does is it adds about $80,000 a year to debt service, for each issue a year to debt service. So in other words, when we do the next bond issue, our forecast, what we forecasted for interest will probably be $80,000 higher each year. When we do the next one, again, $80,000 higher each year. And the third one, probably, I'm sorry, the one after that probably be like $98,000, and the one after that probably be like $98,000. So again, we're talking about higher interest costs going forward. And that's a big factor in what happened in using that here. And just to give you an idea of how that works, rates have been high because of the uncertainty since COVID. Rates actually have been high. What buyers of bonds have been doing when they bid on your bonds, they'll bid a high interest rate, but what they do is they offset it by giving you money back, and that money back reduces what you have to pay in interest. In other words, if they'll say the interest rate is, they'll bid a 5% interest rate, but then they'll give you half of that money back, so that your interest rate actually becomes 2.5%. So they actually give you the cash at closing. It's kind of like when somebody, with a mortgage, somebody gives you back money for your closing cost or whatever. What we're seeing is those premiums, those rates are still staying in the 5% range or the 4.5% range, but those premiums, what we call the money back they give you, is actually becoming less and less, or smaller and smaller, and in some cases none at all. And that's why the interest rates then, if they bid a 5% and they don't give you a premium, then it's a true 5%. If they give you 5%, but they give you back $1 million, then it's probably more like it's probably more like a 3.75% or a 3.5%. So we're seeing those premiums getting smaller. And that also impacts this forecast, because when we did these forecasts, we always built in that those premiums would go back into interest and would lower some of the, would lower the debt service cost each year. We would apply those premiums over the first 3 years of the bonds. So when we get down to the bottom, you'll see what the impact of that is. Grand list is, that second section is somewhat of an unknown. There's two things of concern here going forward that have changed since the last forecast. One is the state has decided to change the reval schedule. So we were supposed to do revals every 5 years. Next year, 23-24 is a reval year, and for those of you who don't know what that means, your houses are being reassessed, they're being revalued, and of course, the market's been really great for, for selling your house, not so great for buying a house. So the value of your house is up. So next year, you're going to see the value of your house go up the way we assess it, which means that you're going to pay more in taxes, even if we didn't change the mill rate, because the value of your property is higher. So reval goes into effect, it'll be for the October 1, 2022 grand list. It goes into effect on the July 1, 2023 budget. So automatically, you're going to have you'll probably have a tax increase. What the state also did is they changed the schedule, and instead of doing it every 5 years, Farmington and 2 other towns in the state got the short end of the stick, as we call it, and as the state admits, and we now have to revalue every 4 years. So in this forecast, instead of having reval next year in 5 years out, there's actually 3 revals built into this as we go out further. So that could be good and bad. One, it's going to add cost. Obviously, you're going to pay $300,000 every time you reval to a reval company. But 2, more frequent revals may actually help us capture the market fluctuations, if there happen to be any, going forward sooner than most other towns. The other thing that is somewhat of a concern in doing this forecast is the state also, after last year's cry that motor vehicle, well, the current administration has in power has a thing against motor vehicle taxes. They would like to eliminate them. And there was more steam added, or logs added to the fire last year when everybody's values on their 20-year-old vehicles, their values went up $3,000 last year because there's such a demand for used cars. So the legislature, working with the assessors, actually changed what's going to happen and how we value motor vehicles going forward. And that's actually going to have the effect of knocking down and preventing large increases in the real motor vehicle grand list. In other words, what they're going to do is you're going to get a set price on your car, and then they're going to depreciate it every year. So regardless of whether your car's value does go up, it's actually going to go down because there's going to be a depreciation schedule. 2, starting next year, they will be doing away with the supplemental motor vehicle. As people, you would get if you buy a car during a certain period of time during the year, you would get a tax on that car in December. It would be what we call supplemental motor vehicle tax. They're doing away with that, and you're actually going to get that tax bill whenever you buy the car. So if you buy the car in August, you'll get the bill in September. If you buy the car in July, you're going to get the bill in August. They're not going to wait and do it all at once. While that has a minimal impact, we do have a line item in our budget of $1 million a year for supplemental motor vehicle tax, and you're going to slowly see that also fade away. And that impacted our forecast for revenues, mostly in the out years, not so much next year, but in the out years. So the grand list was a little bit tricky to project because of reval and because of the changes in the motor vehicle taxes. But we did a projection on the grand list going forward. Other revenues, this year that we're in, we had a windfall from the state. They changed the pilot program, so we had a huge increase in our state pilot. So it actually drove up our grant revenue this year. We're not seeing that out there in the future, and so we went back to using the historical averages for those different revenue categories. And we can see that we do build in increases each year. And we did try to take into effect that in some years, people will argue, well, you're getting $1 million a year in building permits, but again, we're working on averages, we're not working on actual. So we looked at averages and we built in the averages. We are seeing a slowdown in building permits, so there is some activity taking place, slowdown taking place in the economy. So there is so we did build in increases on the non-tax revenues. The net effect is, if you look at the 23-24 column, going all the way down to the tax and mill rate section, we're projecting a tax levy next year of $115 million, projecting a mill rate of 30 mills, which is 0.72 mills above where we are now, which is actually pretty good. It's almost slightly less than a 2.5% tax increase. But because of reval, the actual increase to the average home, which the assessment should be around $233,000. The tax increase will actually probably be closer to 5.1%. So think about, you were at a 1.8% tax increase this year. Next year, that home assessed at $232,000 will have more, will have a 5.1% tax increase. Of that amount, $258 will be the total tax increase will be $339. Of that amount, $258 would be attributable to the high school project. And go forward in that, you could see that using those assumptions and carrying it forward, in 24-25, tax increase, no reval, but a tax increase will be 4.1%. That's higher than what we originally projected, and it's all driven by the increase in the interest rate, and plus the changes in the debt service, the non-high school debt service, the additional debt that we're going to start bringing on. So 4.1% in 24-25, it's $116. I'm sorry, $116 would be attributable to the high school debt. And then in 25-26, tax increase would be 4.31%. The amount attributable to the high school project would be $117. Overall, over the first 5 years of the project, we had, back when we did the original projection, we said that the high school project would cost about $466 to the average homeowner. That's now increased to $491. So it's about a $25 increase in the cost to the homeowner. And obviously, as you go out further, the debt starts to drop off, the project starts to, and so everything starts to stabilize. So by the time you get to 26, 27, you're back down to your 2% tax increases, and actually the high school is not causing any of, it's actually decreasing your debt burden by $1 in that year, and then it goes up, consistently after that, it starts to go down. Again, we do have reval years out there in 27, 28, and we have a reval year out there in 31, 32. So you have three revals coming up, and some unknowns with the grand list, and some unknowns with the motor vehicle taxes. So, and the one thing I would caution you about this is we kind of have a different philosophy than most people than I would I originally had. We loaded up on debt this current year because we knew we knew rates were going up. We knew that we wanted to capture the low rates, and we got in right at the right time to get those low rates. The thought now is that if you listen to half the economists out there, this world's going to crash in the next year, and we're going to have a recession, and the Fed's going to have to start cutting rates. Then you hear people say, no, it's not going to happen. Just my experience is that I've been in this business 44 years. I've done a lot of revals. We used to do them every 10 years, then we did them every 5 years. And I went back and looked at whenever I was involved in a reval, and 70% of the time that I was in a reval, whenever the reval was implemented, right after that we had a recession. So if I were a betting person, I would say that we're probably going to have, there's a really good chance we're going to have a recession next year. I'm not sure how severe it will be, but we probably will have a recession next year, and the Fed will start cutting interest rates, or at least holding the line. Based on that, my actual philosophy or thought now is to try to wait to issue debt instead of as long as I can. And of course, that will depend on cash flow. At a project this size, we can't, and the smaller projects, obviously we have enough money in our reserves to advance cash and manage cash flow. On a project this size, we don't have that type of money sitting in reserve, so we have to issue debt in order to keep paying our contract, or keep paying the contractors. So we will have to issue debt, but again, we're going to try to, at least I'm going to try to manage it to see where rates are going. And so some of these numbers you see, these 4.25, 4.5s, they may come down a little bit and save us a little bit of money as we go forward. We'll manage that. And that's been something I've mentioned to you and to the building committees since 2017, is that this is a forecast on the debt issuance, and we will manage it as best we can to minimize the impact.
And CJ, can I just add one thing?
Yes, go ahead.
And I say it every time that Joe does a forecast, is that I just get nervous that when we do our forecast, that everyone remembers that this forecast is a moment in time, and that it's a moment of time that we're looking at, and that Joe does a wonderful job forecasting, but again, what's happened over the last year, we don't ever know about COVID, we don't know that inflation, we don't know what the state grants are gonna be, we don't know what's gonna happen. So we really are, it's our best guess, and Joe does a wonderful job giving us a best guess, but it is still just a moment in time. And so I say that every time we do it, because people see these numbers and they stick to the numbers and they look at it, but it's just guesstimates on everything, our best guesstimates. And having 44 years of experience, Joe has a pretty good idea what it's going to be, but again, it's just a moment of time. So that's all.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just, I think the numbers are pretty good, but I also, I think the forecast is pretty good, especially for next year. But at the same time, I don't think this is a bad forecast. I know, saying we went from 466 to 491, we actually increased the burden on the taxpayer by $25. But considering what you're getting and considering what we're going through, that's not a bad deal. And even being, 5% over on your project is not a bad deal. I mean, like I mentioned before, there's some projects that came in considerably over. You're 5% over right now on your project. You should probably congratulate your building committee, because that's a good job, in my opinion. And I think, looking at a 491 as being the worst-case scenario, when you have the flexibility that we have, I think you're sitting in a pretty good position.
Well, Kathy did say she's not questioning your forecasts. And, I mean, I'll just kind of add to that. Of course, it is true. Every time we do any of these forecasts, there are a multitude of assumptions that we're basing them on.
Right.
And interest rates, no one a year ago was forecasting that interest rates would go up 3% within roughly 6 months. The last time that happened in this country was over 20 years ago, so it's not something you generally see. So not to question the forecast, but things changed drastically, and as Joe pointed out, this difference in the cost based on the high school project right now is due to interest rates. We didn't know what the Fed was going to do. We couldn't have assumed they'd raise rates as quickly as they did. And with that said, I'll just open it up to questions for anyone else up here on Joe's presentation. Rafina?
Yes. Listen, I'm the top of the class. I have to raise my hand. Okay. So when we all, a couple of years ago, last year, June 3rd, as we were preparing for the referendum, the number that was 466. Next year, over the course of 5 years, it's $466. So if I heard you correctly, based on all of the projections, that number will increase $32 to $498? Your average tax?
No, increase $25 to $491.
$491. Okay.
I think that's $25, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, all things being equal, this is the budget going forward. Your average taxpayer will not really notice any difference because it's a very marginal amount, your average taxpayer. I know that there are implications with that going forward. Now, what happens the following year? Does that number then drop off a little bit?
Well, that's a cumulative number. I mean, eventually it will drop off.
Mhm.
Basically, what you're looking at is, over the next, you're going to, again, next year, it's $258 is of the tax increases attributable to the high school project. The following year, $116 attributable to the high school project. Following year, $117. The following year, it's actually minus 68 cents. The following, in 27, 28, there's a blip because of some drop off on premiums. It actually goes, the cost is $8.74, but then it starts to go down. Basically, once all the debt is, I always like to do this because it always makes Kathy upset, but
Thanks,
I
Joe.
have to think about it. But one of the temptations was when we were putting the last debt issuance together. I said, wouldn't it be great if I just issued $109 million?
That would have been great, actually,
been
given
great,
the fact that the
but
rates were so low.
But the payback, would have been crazy. But what happens is after you get, past 26, 27, you've issued all the debt for the high school.
Okay,
So at that point, you're not adding any additional debt, but you are dropping off interest because you're paying your debt down. And so the high school the high school debt service becomes less of a factor in the overall budget and in the tax increase.
Right.
So you'll start to see, the number go down ever so slowly, but it will not add to the tax burden.
okay. So one of the harshest criticisms that we've heard in the last week, at least I have, is from folks who really are in support of the school, but just want to know how that's going to affect their pocketbooks. And we all stood here and they were like, well, it's the old bait and switch. I just want to make sure that, though, there is no bait, there is no switch. We're still delivering, as we promised, the high school, and it will be a very, very marginal increase that we promised a year and a half ago.
Right, and to be, again, that increase is not as a result of what you heard tonight
Right.
from the building committee. That increase is primarily driven by the change in the tax rate, the change in the interest rates that we're going to have, we project we're going to get by borrowing money. I mean, that's really what's going to drive, what's driving that number. It's not the way it would work is if you go to referendum and you get an additional $10 million appropriation, that should not have an impact because you're getting a higher reimbursement rate from the state of Connecticut. You're actually, if we use the same interest rate, if the interest rates being equal to what our original assumption was, there would actually be a net decrease because you actually would have a $4 million extra dollars in grant reimbursement that would reduce your net municipal cost. Again, when we did that first forecast, it was on $109 million. We're now saying we're only going to issue $105 million. So we're issuing $4 million less. Unfortunately, the cost goes up $25 because the interest rates go up. If we have that recession next year and the rates start going down again, that number will change and that number will come back down.
So about those interest rates, what is the longest we can hold off for the next round of bonding?
That depends on cash flow. And, right now I don't have a really good cash flow forecast on this project. If you start awarding contracts and assuming you break ground in November, all your criticals, it's really going to depend on what it goes out. I'll probably have to sit down and look at what the bids came in at, what the contracts are awarded at, and then what their timeline is for, and then we'll see. My goal is to wait until, we issued $37 million. I think I have $34 million left at this point. So if it goes out at that, it's going to go out at a quicker pace than that.
Right.
But, the goal is to try to push it off probably to May or June, April, May or June, that time frame. If we could push it to July, then these numbers would change completely. So, we'll see how the cash flow goes before we issue debt.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
So the 466 and the 491, that's what everybody's going to hang their hat on, right? Because the 466 is what we gave out there, even though that was an assumption, a good assumption, with really well thought out processes. But it was a snapshot in time.
It was also 3 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And now we're talking 491 with an additional 10 million put into the project. Did you run those numbers for 5 million?
I did, and 5 million would actually keep you at the 466.
So when you said that couple $100,000 doesn't really make a difference, so the difference between that 466 and that 491 is really $5 million.
Right. Basically, what you could figure is every $5 million would be $25. So if you took the actual, full, you took the full $14 million reimbursement, additional money reimbursement, you figure $70 comes off that. You would go below the 466. You'd go from 491, you go 421, 422, somewhere around that area. So it's basically every $5 million.
So basically, anything that we're looking at, whether it's the overage, a portion of the alternates, or all the alternates, it's basically an interpolation between those two numbers. Okay.
Hold on. Any questions down here? For Shana, go ahead.
Since we're talking about $5 million, I noticed that you put the 1928 building, the cost of that, and you said it was bonded at $5 million going out. Does it start next year as well?
No. Actually, if you look at what you're looking at for the 1928 building it would be packaged in 2 bond issues. It would hit in 25, 26, and 26, 27. So when you see the jump in the, again, going back to the forecast in 25, 26, you're going from up to almost $8 million in debt service on non-high school projects. You're going from $7.4 million to $8 million on non-high school projects. In that year, you're talking about putting on half of the debt for the 1928 building. You're putting on probably 2/3 of the debt for the ventilation projects for the schools, and putting in some money for the fire station renovations.
Right, but at that point, the high school building should be almost, if not complete.
Let's see, by 26, 27, all of the high school debt will have been issued.
Joe, for comparison points, when you originally did the forecasts, you didn't have $5 million for the 1928 building. How much did you have the fire stations at?
11.
So
It's a trade.
basically, that's the same 11 million. When we did the original forecast, we have 11 million just for the fire stations. Now we have 5 for the 1928 and 6 for the fire stations.
Yeah,
So it
right.
hasn't increased. That's not an added 5 million that we put into our calculations, okay?
No, it's just the timing of it.
Yeah,
That's really what the original $11 million was over like 4 years. That doesn't make sense. It's really more like, that's not that it doesn't make sense, it doesn't work. It's 2 separate projects now. You're talking about doing a fire station project, and you're talking about doing a 1928 building. Based on the conversations, if you do open school and start the demo on this building, and they could probably tell you better than I can, but once you start demo, you're gonna have an open wall on the 1928 building. You gotta decide what you're gonna do. So you're gonna need money at that point to do something to that building. Otherwise, everybody's gonna walk in and out through the back of it. So obviously, you need money at that point.
actually, I think there's not, I don't know, our 1928 building committee can describe it, but I think as long as you keep the auditorium or the band room, you don't actually have an opening. But that's neither here nor there right now for this argument, discussion. Other questions for Joe and the dollars? Financial questions?
Could I
Yes,
just throw
Kathy,
one,
you
just
can.
one
Go
other
ahead.
comment in, is just that, just so we're clear, because when we throw numbers out, is that the $5 million that Joe is using for the 1928 building, that is with the assumption that we're using some ARPA funds. So I just don't want people to think that the 1928 building, the estimates are coming in, they could, at $5 million. It's more that we're planning on using the ARPA funds for it.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, now, got to ask the other question. We've got, we're talking about bonding. We assume there's going to be some type of money coming back from the state on this bonding? If we do another bonding issue, do we have an assumption we're working off of?
We're still trying to get clarity. You're talking about the extra
If we
$10 million.
bonded- Right, if we
Yeah.
had bonded, I'll grudgingly say you're $10 million. If we bonded $10 million at our previous formula, that would be 1.8 million we'd get back. If we got the 30%, that would be 3 million we'd get back.
That is correct. And Kat?
My understanding is this assumption does not assume we are getting reimbursement on that, but we are working with the state to read the language that was provided at the previous special legislation to see if that would apply.
Okay. So this assumption doesn't account for anything coming back from the state. That's right, Joe? The assumptions you use for 105 million don't assume reducing that by anything back from the state.
The extra 10 million.
No, on the 10 million.
It does not include any type of assumption that there's a reimbursement for that extra 10 million.
Okay.
Basically, the way I handled it was, if you go for referendum, you referendum, whether you pass this referendum, you're going to get 14 million extra dollars than what we have
Yes.
originally had thought.
Yep.
It's how it's utilized. And if you want to utilize it for the project,
Yeah, no, I wasn't even talking about that 14 million. I was more referring to if we bond again, there we go, another referendum, and if it passed, whatever we bond for in the future, we should get something back from the state, although we haven't gotten clarity on what that might be. So that would change the future forecast because there would be money coming back. So if we bonded, again, we'll say $10 million, and we got $3 million back, we would actually not have to bond $10 million, we'd only have to bond $7 million to pay for the project.
well, you would bond, instead of bonding 105 million, you would bond 102.
Thank you, okay, yeah, okay. Any other questions for Joe, since we've let him sit down already? Okay. We will now move on to item E3.
You got a blank number.
Well,
That's the
why don't
question.
you
You want me to go with the 10 million?
Well, you should, probably
Go-
what the committee recommended.
go the 9.7 million for the committee's recommendation, then we'll have discussions and see where
This
we
is-
come out from there. That was their recommendation, so,
I was gonna say 9.7.
Okay.
yes.
All right. I'd like to make a motion, recharge the Farmington High School Building Committee to prepare for a referendum vote to appropriate 9.7 million for the Farmington High School school project.
Second.
We have a motion and a second, and now is time for discussion. I'm not going to ask if there's discussion, I'm just assuming there's some discussion. Okay, who would like to start the discussion on potentially this topic is going out for another referendum for the high school at the recommended from the high school building committee of 9.7. Thoughts on doing so? Ed, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think this makes sense. Thanks again to the building committee for the very detailed and informative presentation, taking us through all the three options. I think it's very obvious that options 1 and 2 are not really the responsible way for us to move forward. There's a financial risk, obviously, with option 1, because these things are still needs. And if they get into the capital budget, we're not getting the reimbursement. That's going to cost us more in the long term. Option 2 has that impact of educational programming. I don't think any of us want to see that. And options 3, as you took us through it, makes a lot of sense. It allows us to cover the portion that's over budget, really due to the inflationary pressures. But at the same time, our net municipal cost is lower than what it was at the original referendum, so our new net municipal cost is 104.3 compared to that 109.3. So I think overall it's a win-win all around, so I support it.
Okay, other questions or comments? Brian?
From what I've heard tonight, I want to say thank you to everyone on the building committee who worked on this. I mean, we have a lot of information, and thank you for all the work that you've done. Seems like we're in a little bit of, not our situation, but because of this, not a project situation, but an industry situation, that we have to adjust our budgeting. So really what we're doing is we're adjusting our budget number and what we can spend. We're not increasing taxes. In fact, from what I've heard, taxes will actually go down a little bit, which is a good thing if that's, well, it
No.
won't cost us as much.
No.
Is that incorrect?
Yes.
Okay, so I misheard something. But it does, well, not, yeah, taxes won't go down, but some of that money will go into the budget, so we can spend money we got from our state representatives on the school by increasing this budget, which is really helpful, but some of that money can also go to offsetting the costs to the town. I think that's what we were talking about. Not that it would decrease taxes, but it does decrease our costs a little bit, because that money can go toward it, correct?
No, the money that, the additional money that the state gave us for this project must go towards this project. What it will do is decrease the amount that we have to bond.
That's what I meant, that's what I meant.
Okay, and as Joe pointed out, unfortunately, with the interest rates, it still increases our debt service on that, but
True.
it decreases the amount we have to bond.
But by increasing this, the amount we're spending, it allows us to access the money that we got from the state, the 14.7 million.
We can use that regardless of whether we go out to bond.
Oh, okay.
We will use that regardless. The 14% or $14 million is going towards the 135, the original bonding issue. So it doesn't go
Right.
towards anything in the future. That's what that's going towards.
Okay. Just for clarification.
Other questions or comments?
Just a comment. I think this is a really wise decision to go out to referendum. I wasn't in favor originally going out to referendum because I remember the agita that I had the first time around and the sleepless nights and everybody that pitched in to make that a success. I think going forward, we just have to make sure that we communicate what the plan is and try and make it, because this is not super simple. But at the end of the day, to me, this is an efficient use of the money that the state has given us for a project that will eventually, if we use the money, lower the net municipal cost to this town to $105 million. At the end of the day, most taxpayers are just looking at their wallets and how much they have to pay in taxes. And with a, $25 increase, we have not surprised anybody. I mean, it's a little surprise, but we haven't been irresponsible in any way. That is, as Joe mentioned, a cost of the inflationary nature of the town and the state and the country at this time. So if we can explain that to people, the high school will be built on a little over budget. However, the net cost to the town is lower. We are getting the school that we were promised for $25 extra.
It's not. The net cost is higher. It will be higher.
The net municipal cost to the town will be,
Yes, the net municipal cost will be down by $4 million. Yes.
Yes, lower.
right.
Yep.
Is that not what I said?
Yeah, you said to the taxpayer, but their taxes are going up on the interest, but the net bonding.
Right, but we're only paying 25. Your average taxpayer, didn't Joe say that it was $25 more
Yeah.
to the average taxpayer than what we promised from 466 to 491?
Correct.
Okay.
Keith?
So, a lot of, the biggest thing for me in preparing for this was the ad alternate list. And as I said in my question, I thought it was important that each ad alternate, we would go through it and really figure out, is there a need for each of these things that, again, had at one point been said, we do not need them. Why should they be included? And I think a really good job of explaining those was done. I agree, if we're going to build a school, then we should do it all the way. I think they've done a good job explaining why these things are necessary. That being said, I'm hung up on the potential, on that 5.9 number, that it could be 3.9. And at that point, if we go forward with the 9.7, right, was the initial number, as a taxpayer and people really, entrusting us with their dollars, there's potential that we don't need that. We could need, 7.7. There's no real way of knowing that right now. I'd like to see as much of this get in as possible, for sure. But that $2 million takes care of wood ceilings, operable wall, and 3 or 4 other of these things, on this ad alternate list. Or it takes care of a tennis courts, operable wall. It's hard just to write a blank check without knowing what that number is. I know no one here has a crystal ball, but that's where I'm hung up. And I don't know if the building committee spent however many months, nights sharpening their pencils and doing that, and I think that's what the town charges us to do. I'm in favor of getting as much stuff as possible. From a personal perspective, I have 3 kids that are gonna go through these schools. I want them to be nice. I want them, but we're here to make sure that we're being responsible with everybody's money and to try to serve both masters, get a really great school, have everything that's in the ed spec, but also do it as not cheaply, but as fiscally responsible as possible. So I've only been on council for a year, and the thing that I always hear is what Farmington does well is we go through this stuff and through it and through it. And I think it's credit to the building committee that, there's projects out there that are at 8%, I think was the number that was said, which is basically where inflation is at right now, and we're at half of that, and that's awesome. And maybe there's more that we can do. Maybe. I hope I'm not keeping us here for another 3 hours, but we gotta get to it.
It's still early. It's not even 10 o'clock. Thank you, Keith. Other questions, comments?
So, yeah, I've had the, say, the luxury of spending a lot of time talking about this over the course of the last 60 days as these numbers have been going out and coming in. And anybody who knows me, I'm not one to want to just spend money to spend money. Yeah, I look at cost and I look at value. You know, some of the discussions, as the building committee would know, like porcelain tile, it didn't take very long to convince me on that one. Took a little longer on the operable wall. I say I think they've got me. But at the end of the day, we have to look at, you know, the overall picture. And I share a little bit of Keith's things, and I do think there's obviously some room. The part that I don't know and the part I haven't experienced is, we go down this road over the next 2 years, and is there a possibility that this is under budget? And I will tell you, for every person I've ever built a house for, that doesn't work out that way. You know, the money that you allot is the money that's spent, and you start to pick and choose. Now, you know, taking my building committee hat off and putting my council hat on, looking, you know, at the overall picture, we can sit here and play with the numbers. At the end of the day, the building committee has the final decision on what actually goes in and what doesn't. So whether we take out 300 grand and say we don't really like those windows that let in the fresh air, you know, the building committee may say, you know what, we're going to go after something, you know, something else, and we're going to prioritize that. So it's hard to sit here in a vacuum and just say, let's pick a number. I do agree with Keith that, you know, we've got to be stewards of the money. $25 is not a lot, but to some people it's a lot. And that's, I think, one thing that we have to keep in mind, that when we make this decision and we vote on this 9.7, that we don't take it lightly. You know, I've been fortunate enough to be very successful at different parts of my life. Well, not everybody has. And we have to keep that in mind. I've spent a lot of time in town with, you know, both work and living here, and if there's anybody who ever said anything about Farmington, I'd sum it up. It's a really good balance between low tax rates and good schools. Any realtor will tell you that, any builder will tell you that, anybody who lives in town will tell you that. I do think the building committee did a good job, and, you know, exclude myself for that for a second and say that overall, the committee looked at this and said, you know, we're getting this extra reimbursement for 14.7 million. We're not going back looking for 14.7. We're only going back for the overage and those things that we really had to hold our nose when we cut or put them in the ad alternate list. So I would be hard pressed to go down further than that. Maybe that difference between that 1.7 and that 2.7, whatever, that $1 million that is within those single bids. So I probably could support something a hair less. I just don't know if I would go very far down.
Thank you. Joe?
I just want to thank Meg, Johnny, the rest of the committee. I can't imagine the hours that you guys have spent doing this. It is obviously painstaking for the last how many years that you've been going through it, so I do appreciate all your hard work. I know it's all on your own time, and I know you've taken away from your own family time and personal lives, so thank you, thank you, thank you. Obviously, we all voted on a school a couple of years ago. We had all this in mind, that we're going to provide A, B, and C to them, and I want to see that school be completed as we said. But like, you know, we're saying, we have to be a little bit of stewards of the money and sort of hope for trying to get the best bang for our buck. So I would like to see it come under the 9.7. Unfortunately, I would be more happy with an 8 or 8.5 to do it. I think we can, you know, still get the major components that you're looking for in order to compete, in order to facilitate the school that you want to give to our students and to our community. So I think if we can come down a little bit, I can be very supportive of this, and let's get this project completed in a timely fashion.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to see us on this council united in whatever we do going forward. I think that sends a great message to the public. So I'd like to find a place where we can be 100% a unanimous vote. That being said, when I take my trusty little calculator out, which I always have up here, if we bonded instead of 9.7, $8 million. And we made an assumption that we're only getting 18% from the state, which I'm hoping we can at the very least assume. That would bring us 1.44 million back, which would be a total of 9.44. 8.25 million brings us, with the 18%, just at 9.7 million total. I would be very comfortable if we bonded 8,250,000. We can assume that 18%, so we're getting the money we need to get this project done at the full ask for the building committee, and if by any chance, we're hopeful assumption, because the state has already told us 30% is the proper money we should be getting on this project, we would actually be getting an additional $1 million for that. So we would actually be getting a little more than that ask for the building committee. So I think we could go out 8.25 and we get everything we want and everything the building committee's asking. Questions?
And this is more of a sentimentality thing, but I just, as a council, I mean, there's other big projects coming, 1928, and other things coming down the road, and it's why I think doing what we're doing right now is so important, so people know that we don't just rubber stamp everything that comes through. What you just said makes a lot of sense. If we can get and make sure that our legislators are getting us that reimbursement money on 8.2, then the project can be made whole for whatever being presented here, correct?
That's what the numbers show right here.
Wait, but lowering the amount of money that's requested, how does that help things in the long run? I don't understand.
We're not going out to bond as much, so we're getting that money. It's coming back. We're getting back from the state for reimbursement. We're getting, on 8,250,000, we'd get 1.485.
But I thought we
back
were
from the
already,
state.
that the bonding, that it was 30% reimbursement
This
rate.
is, well, we don't know that, they haven't told us that on a second referendum. We can assume that, but if they only give us what they were going to give us the first time, the 18, that would be the 1,485,000.
So what would be the net municipal impact to a taxpayer, the difference between 8.25?
8.25 less
And then
1.485.
Right, and then the 9.7 that's being requested.
Well, you're reducing your bonding from 9.7.825, so you're taking off almost $1.5 million from that.
Right,
From
but
what we're
didn't
going
Joe
out to
say that
bond.
if you move a couple $100,000, I don't know what the difference would be in $1 million in terms of numbers?
We'd have to go down to 5% to be less,
5 million.
what's that?
5 million.
I'm sorry, 5 million on the bonding to go to the 466.
Right, I understand that, so I'm saying currently, then it's a $25 increase. We said it was $466 a couple of years ago, now it's $491. If we were to go and bond the $8.25 million, right?
We'd only be dropping down roughly $1.5 million from what Joe's calculations were.
Right, so I'm asking, what does that mean to your average taxpayer? It's $491, so now is it for?
Instead of $25, it'd probably be
85?
$5 less than that, so it'd probably be, about 486 probably. Should be the rough number. I mean, that's a rough calculation. So instead of 5 million.
CJ,
take off
you're
that.
assuming the actual referendum is 8.25.
If, Joe, if we went to referendum for 8.25 million instead of the 9.7, we would be getting a reimbursement at 18% of $1,485,000, right?
So, just to be clear, what I was going with this is this is a confusing subject matter, these reimbursements,
Yeah.
and what we're going to referendum, and what's actually coming out of our pocket. Going for the 9.7, right now, we just said that we weren't in that debt service, in that 491, we weren't taking into account any reimbursement.
Right.
We were going for 10 million, we're adding 10 million to the project, it's adding $25 per taxpayer for an average household. But then if you start reducing the overall number, you're actually going out for less than the project, and that reimbursement's a little less. And I want to be clear in that, just because you're saying you're getting an additional back, it will help our debt service beyond what Joe laid out, if we assume the 18.93, which I think is actually a little higher now. I don't know if that changes or not, but regardless, 19%. And then there's some potential to get 30. So in essence, if we went out for 9.7, we actually would be bonding like 2.7 less, 30%, 2.8 something.
If we got that.
Right, if we got it. If not, it would be one
If-
something, and then, but I want to be clear, you're suggesting that we go out for 8.25, and that would be where we would reduce.
We'd still be spending, for reimbursement, and Kat, whoever's better on reimbursement, if this project is costing us $9.7 million, and we're going to get 18%, which I believe is 1.746, that would be $8 million that we'd actually have to spend after we got only 18% reimbursement. $8 million. Because whatever we're going to have to go out to bond for is less than what we need to spend. 18% less, right?
Right.
So if we went out to bond for $8,250,000, that's giving us a $250,000 cushion over the 18. We could really go out for $8 million to bond, which means we can spend $9.7 million with only 18% return.
Yeah, let me just,
Go ahead.
okay, so we're talking about authorization.
Yep.
Okay, so now so I'm just trying to work through
Yep.
what you've said. So you're saying, let's just, for ha-has, it's easier for numbers, 8 million, okay, just so it's easy for the math. So now, the original project cap was how much?
135.6.
So 135.6, and now you're adding to that $8 million. So your authorization now would be,
Well, but for this, we're not authorizing.
when we're doing a referendum, you're adding your number to
But
the
not-
original number. It's an additional supplement, you're raising your rate.
But no, this referendum is only for the addition. It's not for the two numbers, because we've already approved the 135, I believe. That's
No.
because all these
No,
numbers that we
no.
had written here, we were just going to make a motion, the request was for 9.7 million.
It's a request, but it's a request to a supplemental request to the original bonding of the 135.
So the request that we're going to make here, you're saying instead of 135 is going to be 144.7?
Yeah, we're increasing
I know we're increasing our total ask, but I
Right.
thought we've already asked and we've already gotten numbers back from the state. I'm confused then.
My understanding of how the bond resolution will work is the bond, it's something what we did a couple of years ago. What the bond resolution will say is, shall the voters authorize an additional X millions of
Right.
dollars to this project to make the total appropriation Y.
Okay,
Okay, so-
but,
So the actual question itself would just be on the dollar amount, the additional appropriation.
right, so in this case, the 9.7 million.
And it will cap, it also will cap it at that, what's already been approved plus the additional.
Right, so it'll tell us what the total is, but it will say the additional 9.7 million.
Right, for a total appropriation, right?
Total appropriation.
Of one.
Okay, so, yes. So if we're talking about the 9.7 project cost, what we also said was what the bonding would be. When we went out to referendum last time, we said the 110 maximum bonding.
We put that in the explanatory
Yes.
text, yeah.
What I'm saying here is we shouldn't have to bond any more than an additional $8,250,000.
I think it's less than that, but.
Yeah, I think it's 8 million, it's actually 8 million, but
9.7,
yes.
It's
Yeah.
9.7 million. take out-
18% is
I went
1.746,
to
so
19,
it's,
'cause I think it's 18.93.
yeah.
So I went to 19%, so if we went out for referendum for 9.7 and got it, we get a reimbursement of 19%. Forget the 30 for now. We actually would be, we would be allotting our cost 7.857 million.
Right.
So-
So I want to be clear, and I don't think we have to have this exact number right now, because we're recharging the committee to go out to, or do we? Do we have to know the exact number? Whatever we say now, is this what is going to be on a referendum, or is that a future date where
That
we
would
say
be, that would be the November yes, the November meeting.
Yeah,
Okay.
The motion you would make would
Yes.
be on November 15th to do a resolution and send it to the town meeting and referendum. However, November 15th triggers a blackout period.
Right.
So if you were to do, the plan would have to be to have a newsletter explaining these things, and the hopes was we would have the number we would going out, because we only have
Okay.
a few weeks to communicate.
But just, CJ, one thing, again, regardless about the number, you said something, and I just want to get clarity on this one point. Let's take the $8 million
Yep.
number. And you said with the $8 million and with the reimbursement and with the various things, we should still be able to get the things on the list. I think, is that?
Yeah, if we're bonding for $8 million, but we'd still have, the 9.7 is still the magic number.
Right.
This project, we're talking about this project costing 9.7. What I'm saying is, we should not have to bond over 8 million. We could actually bond slightly under $8 million. So will we have, Kat, do you know, will we have an idea from the state whether we're going to be 18 point whatever or 30 before we get to?
We would hope that we would have that information from the state. We started talking with them today. We went into today assuming no reimbursement on the additional.
Right, that's,
What-
and that's sort of the point. I mean, I want to make this very clear to the public right now, that I'm not so comfortable bonding another 9.7 million, because we assume we're going to be getting something back. So even at the lower number, we shouldn't have to bond, even, Johnny just did the numbers, just under $9 million. So we should be bonding an additional less than $9 million. That, at 18% reimbursement, would get everything on that list of 9.7. So we've significantly reduced that. If by any chance they gave us the 30%, I think that's, how much more than that? Another 5 million or something. It's over $2 million. So now you're, dropping down significantly from that, just under 7, you're in the 6s and 5s. So we're much closer. The bonding is going to bring us much closer to that 466 number that Rafina was, and Joe gave us earlier, than we are right now, because we are going to get something back from the state, and that won't be what our bonding is.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I'm still, I guess,
Yep.
we still haven't got to the point that what I'm confused about is
Yep.
that you can only spend what the appropriation is.
Yep.
Okay, so our number, whether it's, we started out with 109.3, and if we request 9.7, it becomes 104.3. That's all we can spend. If you now have it being $8 million, regardless of what the reimbursement is, that 104 now has gone down $1.7 million. So you're only be able to spend that amount of money. You always have to put in the total of what. So again, they've asked for a 9.7. If you're giving them 8, that number is now $102 million. You only can get $102 million worth of work.
Okay, I think we're kind of talking in two different directions.
Okay.
I'm saying we should not have to bond. We should be bonding less than $8 million. If we are saying they need $9.7 million for this project, and we all agree we can do that, we have to be aware that it should not cost us more than $8 million for additional bonding.
But are you saying we would ask for the 9.7? Like at the first referendum, we really only wanted to bond 110 million,
Right.
but we asked for the full
That's,
135.
yes, the 9.7 and the other number, they would both be in there. On the referendum, I think we'd show both numbers, just like we did the first time, whether you're showing the total number or you're showing 9.7, but bonding 7.985 or whatever it is. I just want to make sure.
We're asking for an authorization to spend and an authorization to bond.
Yes, because that's, to the point of Joe's numbers, he was assuming 9.7. We're not going to be bonding 9.7. We're going to be bonding less than that.
Right, for his, yes,
Yes.
yes, okay.
Okay, now I'm supremely confused.
Hold
Oh,
on, Rufina,
you
let
go
me-
first.
Let me, so I'm going to sum this up. We go out for referendum for 9.7 million.
Yes.
Okay, our town cost at a 19% reimbursement in rounding is 7.85 million. That's what we actually have to bond. If we happen to get the 30%, that same 9.7 million that we're gonna put into the project would then cost us 6.79 million. So the bonding would be less. Joe ran numbers at 10 million
yes.
even though we aren't using the 10 million with zero reimbursement. There's actually reimbursement, so that's what CJ's trying to get to. So if we vote tonight at 9.7, our capped rate for the actual bonding would be 7.857. We can't do any less than that because we don't know the answer on that 30%, but it could go down. Does that clarify it?
Not a single bit, no, I'm just- Okay. I thought the purpose of the referendum was, yes, to extend the amount of money that we are budgeting for this project. From 135, let's just use big numbers because that's all I can do. Not a math major. So we're going from approximately 135 to 145. Yes?
Correct.
No, approximately?
Yeah.
Approximately, yes.
Okay. And in that, when we go to referendum, we're asking our voters to say, we are getting $14 million from the state. Can we use that $14 million for this project? Therefore, our net municipal cost would then be lower, so it'd be 104 million, and before it was 109, something like
Yeah.
that, 10?
Started at
All right,
110 for round
10.
numbers, yeah.
Is that correct? Okay. So I get the point about trying to save a couple of dollars by bonding less at the interim, but I don't know that it makes that much sense if we're only talking, and I am very careful. I understand the $25 is it's money. We are not being fiscally irresponsible, and we're taking everybody's or our responsibility seriously as a town. But if we are just looking at the difference between $1 million, 9.7 and 8 it doesn't, in the end, make that much of a difference in terms of what the net taxpayer would.
All right, let me try and clarify. I'm not reducing what the project scope is or what the cost is. We're still, the building committee is still getting $9.7 million.
Okay,
I'm saying we won't have to bond $9.7 million.
okay,
In what we should assume is our very worst-case scenario, we bond just under 8 million, and if we get that 30%, even less. So I'm just talking about what we're bonding. So it's going to be more attractive to our taxpayers than the forecast that Joe was showing, because Joe was just, because we don't have any numbers yet, assuming that we're picking up the tab on everything. And he'd like to round up to 10 instead of 9.7. But, so those numbers are going to be less. And I just want the taxpayers to understand the 491 number that we were talking about earlier, that Joe said, it won't be that high.
gotcha.
So we'll be getting something back. How much closer to 466 will be determined by what that final reimbursement is.
Okay, let's vote.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I guess my only question
Yes.
is, does all of that go in the referendum question, or is it really just the
It's going to be a
authorization?
really long question. It's going to have everything no. It's the question, if we follow suit from last time, it'll say the 9.7, and once we get what our reimbursement rate is, it'll say what we're bonding our municipal
And that probably won't be in the question, but it'll be in the note,
body.
body of, in the note,
Like we did
yeah.
last
Do we as a body determine what the referendum question is?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so when we get to
We
that
get
point.
to talk about this again.
Let's
Yes.
go.
Okay. Any other questions? That being said, we have a motion on the table. We have a second. All for a referendum vote, recharging the Farmington High School Building Committee to prepare a referendum vote to appropriate an additional $9.7 million for the Farmington High School building project. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passed unanimously. Very nice. Okay, with that, new business. Seeing none, before I ask for an adjournment, as I must do, I'll leave you the quote. Think about every problem and every challenge we face. The solution to each one is with education. George Herbert Walker Bush. Move to,
And I would like to make a motion to adjourn the October 25th, 2022 special town council meeting.
we have a motion, a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Up on my chair.
10:04, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.